Before we drift away, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more calming sleep stories. Sweet dreams await. It was late when they arrived. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. A creeping fog rolled over the path, hiding the way ahead. The old lodge loomed in the distance, its silhouette barely visible in the mist. The drive had been long, winding through narrow roads that seemed to disappear into the trees. No lights, no signs, just the deep, unnerving silence of the woods. But they were here now, and there was no turning back. The headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the worn sign that read, "Hollow Pines Lodge, Welcome." The letters were faded, barely legible. The lodge looked ancient, its wooden structure sagging slightly, as if it had been weathered by decades of storms. It was the kind of place that invited curiosity but warned against staying too long. The car came to a stop. The sound of the engine sputtered before dying completely. There was only the wind now, rustling the trees and carrying the faintest whisper of something, or someone, just beyond the reach of sight. "Let's get inside," one of them said, their voice cracking the stillness of the night. But even as they spoke, there was something in the air, something wrong. The front door creaked open, revealing an entryway dimly lit by a few scattered lamps. The floorboards groaned beneath their feet as they stepped inside, the warmth of the lodge a welcome relief from the chill of the forest. "Hello?" called out one of them, their voice sounding too loud in the quiet. No answer. They stood there for a moment, unsure whether to call out again. It felt like the lodge was holding its breath, waiting. Then the door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the hall. The heavy thud of it resonated in their bones, and suddenly the air felt thicker, pressing in, suffocating almost. "Did anyone hear that?" one of them whispered, their eyes wide. But no one had the answer, only the silence that followed. They stood in the dark entryway, frozen as the door's slam reverberated through the room. It wasn't the wind. They could feel it, the weight of the silence pressing against them. A soft, almost imperceptible creaking from above echoed through the rafters. Someone or something was up there. The air was still warm, but it was thick with a heaviness that made breathing feel more like an effort than a natural thing. The smell of wood, wet earth, and something else, something faintly metallic, hung in the air, making their skin crawl. "Okay, that's a little weird," one of them muttered, nervously laughing as if trying to brush off the unease. Another voice, sharper this time, interrupted. "We need to get out of here." But the door, the one they had just come through, was gone. No, not gone. It had disappeared entirely, swallowed up by the dark wooden walls that seemed to shift, just slightly, as though the lodge itself were adjusting to their presence. The room before them had no windows, only dim lights that flickered overhead, casting long shadows that twisted unnaturally across the walls. The stone fireplace was cold, the remnants of old ash sitting in the grate. The furniture was sparse, mismatched, and oddly positioned, as though no one had been there in years. "What the hell is going on?" the third voice broke in, trembling now. This is insane." It wasn't just the sudden disappearance of the door that unnerved them. It was the sensation, the strange sense of being watched. They weren't alone. They could all feel it. Something was in the shadows, something that didn't belong. Then a low hum started. At first, it was barely audible, just a vibration against the floorboards. But it grew louder, rising like a distant, buzzing insect, filling the room with a low, throbbing noise. Suddenly, the lights flickered brighter and brighter until they seemed to be on the verge of exploding, then plunged the room into near-complete darkness. Panic rose like a wave. Someone reached for their phone, only to realize their flashlight function didn't work. The room was void of any light now, except for the faint glow of something moving just out of reach. "Turn it back on. Please turn it back on," someone begged, their voice trembling. In the blackness, they heard it, a soft scraping sound like nails running along the edge of stone. "Did you hear that?" came the whisper, barely above a breath. "Something's out there." No one spoke as they slowly edged closer together, backs pressed against the walls. The room felt bigger now, the shadows longer, the corners darker. And then, without warning, the lights flickered back on, just for a moment. But what they saw in that brief flash sent a chill running through their veins. The front door was back. It stood open, though the fog outside had thickened, curling like smoke at the edges. But something else stood beyond it, something large and black, watching them through the mist. It had no distinct shape, just a massive shadow that seemed to absorb the light around it. The eyes, they were the only feature visible, glowed faintly, like two embers from a dying fire. They didn't know whether it was real. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a figment of their imagination. But they knew one thing for sure: it was there. The figure stood motionless, observing them, unblinking. The sound of their hearts pounding in their chests drowned out the silence. The shadow seemed to breathe in time with them, a slow, deep inhalation that felt far too close. "What is that?" someone whispered, their voice barely audible, hoarse with fear. The shadow took a slow, deliberate step forward, its movement unnatural, almost as if it was dragged by some invisible force. And then, as the lights flickered once more, it was gone. Vanished. The door slammed shut again with such force that the walls shook. The heavy hum, now louder, reverberated through the room, vibrating against their teeth. It was no longer coming from the walls. It was coming from somewhere deeper within the lodge. Something ancient. Something buried. "Maybe we should leave," one of them suggested, but they all knew it wasn't an option anymore. "We're stuck here," another muttered, their voice small, breaking under the pressure of the dread filling the room. The thick silence returned as if nothing had happened at all. But no one dared to move. "Should we explore?" someone ventured after a long pause, but the fear in their eyes betrayed their uncertainty. They moved slowly, as though the very act of walking might stir something beneath the floorboards. The lodge seemed alive now, the air pressing in from all directions, suffocating them. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead, walls seeming to close in with every step. Faint whispers, like the distant rustling of dry leaves, slid along the edges of their consciousness. One of them reached for the door to the next room, their hand trembling as they turned the handle. It creaked open with an agonizing slowness, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The whispers grew louder. "Come closer," they seemed to say. "Come closer." With a deep breath, they stepped inside. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing an oppressive darkness that stretched far beyond the edge of their vision. It was as though the room was too vast to comprehend, its boundaries disappearing into an endless void. They hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the air pressing down on them, thick with something ancient and oppressive. The darkness didn't feel like a simple absence of light. It felt alive, like it was watching them, waiting for them to make a move. "Do we really want to go in there?" someone asked, their voice wavering, but there was no answer. The room remained silent, as if it had no intention of responding. They stood in the doorway for what felt like an eternity. The weight of their fear anchored them in place, their feet unwilling to cross the threshold. And yet, there was something else, an inexplicable pull, as though the room itself was calling to them, coaxing them in. It was the sound of something moving, scraping, or perhaps whispering that broke their stillness. Low, faint whispers that came from within the room, pulling their attention like a magnet. It was almost as if the darkness had a voice that only they could hear. Against all reason, they stepped forward. The floorboards beneath their feet were warped and uneven, groaning with every step. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that their breath became visible in front of them, like a thick mist. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the walls themselves were closing in on them. They finally reached the center of the room. At the far end, barely visible in the darkness, stood something, or rather, someone. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, with long, tattered clothing that hung from its frame like shrouds. Its skin was a pale, sickly shade, almost translucent, and its eyes were empty, black pits that seemed to absorb any light that dared to come near. But it wasn't the figure that made their skin crawl. It was the sensation, the overwhelming feeling that they were no longer alone in the room, that there were others hidden in the shadows waiting. A loud crash came from somewhere behind them. A bookcase had fallen over in the hallway, the noise echoing down the narrow corridor. Panic surged, but they dared not turn their backs to the room. The figure, if that's what it was, remained perfectly still, its gaze fixed on them, unblinking. It seemed to be waiting for something, but what? The whispers grew louder. "Come closer, come closer." "Did you hear that?" someone gasped, their voice tight with fear. But before anyone could respond, the room grew impossibly darker. The shadows seemed to deepen, swallowing everything around them. The walls seemed to shift, groaning as if in protest, and the floor beneath their feet began to tremble. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. But what they saw now was nothing like before. The figure that had been standing at the far end of the room was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. In its place, there was now something much more sinister, a large, black mirror framed in tarnished silver. It reflected nothing at first, only a deep, empty void. But as they stared into it, something moved within the darkness, something that should not have been there. The mirror began to ripple, like the surface of a pond disturbed by an unseen force. Slowly, a shape began to emerge from the darkness within it, shapeless at first but gradually solidifying. It was a face, a twisted, contorted face, its eyes wide open in an eternal scream. The skin was rotted, half missing, and the jaw hung loosely from its skull, as if it had been ripped apart by some invisible force. "Get away from it!" someone screamed, their voice laced with panic. But it was too late. The figure in the mirror began to move, its eyes following them as they stumbled backward. The face twisted in agony, its mouth opening wider and wider until it was a gaping maw, releasing a low, guttural sound that rattled their bones. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping even further as the thing in the mirror stretched its limbs, long, bony fingers that reached toward them, as if trying to pull itself out of the glass. They backed away, but the room seemed to stretch, the walls closing in, the mirror growing larger and larger with every step. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, as though the lodge itself was speaking to them, calling to them. One of them reached out, trembling, trying to grab the handle of the door, but it was gone. The doorway had vanished, replaced by an endless, swirling mass of shadows that seemed to pull at their very souls. "Help me. We need to get out," another voice cried, but it was drowned out by the rising cacophony of whispers that filled the room. They could hear footsteps now, faint at first, but growing louder. It wasn't just their own breathing and panicked movements. They were not alone. Something was in the room with them, moving in the dark. They could hear the faint sound of claws scraping against wood, a slow, deliberate pace that was far too close. It was circling them, stalking them. But they could see nothing. The darkness hid everything. Then a low, raspy voice echoed from the shadows. "You should have left when you had the chance." The floor beneath their feet trembled again, and the lights flickered one last time, casting everything into pitch blackness. They could feel it now, something cold, wet, brushing against their skin, as though the air itself had turned to water, pulling them into the deep. The darkness pressed in on all sides. The whispers, the scraping, the footsteps, they were everywhere. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the sound stopped. For a moment there was nothing. No movement, no noise, just the faint scent of decay hanging in the air. And then, something spoke again. But this time it wasn't from the shadows. It was from behind them. The voice was clear but heavy with an unnatural echo. "You are not alone. You never were." The darkness pressed in closer, thicker than ever before. Every movement they made felt stifled, as though the air itself was trying to suffocate them. The room had transformed from an oppressive space into something more. A living entity, breathing and pulsating with a force that made their skin crawl. It was no longer just a building. It was alive. They stood motionless, not daring to make a sound, eyes wide in fear, breaths shallow. The silence was suffocating, but even more unsettling was the distinct feeling that they were being observed. They could feel it on the backs of their necks, crawling like fingers, tracing their every movement, their every thought. Suddenly, a loud thud broke the silence, sending them all jumping. It came from the floor above, a heavy, deliberate sound as if something, or someone, was walking up there. Slow, rhythmic steps, deliberate as if it were in no rush. Each footfall echoed through the walls, vibrating beneath their feet. Someone whispered, "Did you hear that?" But no one replied. They were all listening, straining for any other sound, any other clue about what was happening. And then, as if in response, the footsteps stopped. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the dim lights above them. In the pitch darkness, the only sound was the frantic beating of their hearts. The temperature plummeted, and for the briefest moment, they could see their breath in front of them, misting out in jagged clouds. And then they heard it, a low, gurgling, growling sound. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was something else, something primal, something that should not have been possible. The sound seemed to be coming from the very walls, from beneath the floorboards, from the deep, hidden spaces of the lodge. It echoed with a hollow, guttural tone that sent shivers of dread through every bone in their bodies. "Stay close," someone whispered, though it barely reached the others over the noise. "We need to get out of here. Now." But as if on cue, the walls around them shifted, groaning and creaking, as though the very structure of the lodge was alive. The shadows deepened. The temperature dropped even further, and when they turned back toward the door, it was gone. Again, just like before. In its place stood a narrow, twisting hallway, one they hadn't noticed before, and one that seemed to stretch impossibly far. At the far end, a dim, flickering light pulsed weakly, as if beckoning them forward. But the hallway itself seemed to shift, as if it were not entirely static, constantly bending and warping as though the lodge was reshaping itself, responding to their presence. We need to move, one of them said, voice quivering with both fear and uncertainty. They had no choice but to step into the corridor. The air felt heavier now, thick with the stench of mildew and something worse, something rotting, decaying. As they walked, the wooden floor creaked underfoot, each step echoing unnervingly loud in the narrow, winding passage. The dim light at the end was their only guide. As they moved deeper, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in, the ceiling lower, as if the lodge were shrinking with every step they took. The temperature continued to plummet, and the air itself began to feel wrong, thick with something unnatural. They could feel it now, crawling up their spines, an ancient, malevolent force surrounding them. Then they came to a stop. At the end of the hallway was an open door, but it was not a door to a room. It was a door to something much more unsettling. A vast, blackened cavern stretched out before them, the edges of it too dark to see. The walls of the cavern were lined with jagged rocks that seemed to pulse with a dull red glow, and in the center, the ground seemed to writhe as if the earth itself was alive. In the center of the cavern, a strange figure stood. At first, it looked like nothing more than a shadow, barely visible against the backdrop of the cavern's darkness. But as they stepped closer, it became clear. It was a man, or at least something that resembled one. Tall, impossibly thin, with unnaturally long arms that hung like tattered, skeletal limbs at his sides. His face was gaunt, skin stretched tightly over his bones, with hollow, empty eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. What are you? Someone dared to ask, their voice barely more than a breath. The figure didn't respond at first. It just stood there watching them with those lifeless eyes. And then, slowly, it lifted one of its long, thin arms and pointed toward the farthest corner of the cavern. At first, they couldn't see anything, but as their eyes adjusted to the faint red glow, something became visible. A door, far in the distance, so far it looked like a tiny sliver. It wasn't a door like the others. It was made of iron, twisted and warped as if time had taken its toll on it, and the ground around it seemed to shudder in anticipation. "You need to go," the figure rasped, his voice a low, echoing hiss. "Now." Before they could respond, the figure's head tilted to one side, its long neck stretching unnaturally with an audible crack. The hollow eyes narrowed, and the air grew thick with a suffocating pressure. Then, without warning, it began to move, its limbs jerking at odd angles as it approached them. The noise it made was a low, wet, slithering sound, like skin dragging over stone. "Move! Get out of here!" someone screamed, grabbing the nearest person and pulling them toward the door. But the cavern was shifting now, twisting like the very ground beneath them was changing. The walls closed in, and the red glow from the distant door grew brighter, too bright as if it were drawing them in, beckoning them to step forward. Then the ground beneath their feet gave way. The floor cracked open like an old, rotting egg, splintering and breaking in every direction. The sound of splintering wood and cracking stone filled the air as they were pulled into the darkness below. They fell. The ground beneath them splintered, and in that split second, everything went dark. The air turned thick, suffocating. The sensation of falling lasted far too long, longer than it should have, as if the very laws of gravity were being twisted around them. The walls of the cavern had given way, but it felt as if the very space around them was stretching, distorting, pulling them into an endless void. Their bodies collided with something hard, jagged, and cold, stone perhaps, but there was no time to think, no time to process. The moment their bodies hit the floor, the pain shot up their limbs like electric shock waves. It took a moment for them to recover from the fall, their breaths coming in short, frantic bursts. But the fear, the terror, they didn't have time to focus on that. Something was wrong. The cavern had swallowed them whole, but the ground beneath them didn't feel solid anymore. It felt alive, moving, shifting, pulsing like the flesh of some monstrous beast. Groaning, they pushed themselves to their feet. The faint red glow from above was gone, replaced by an even deeper darkness, a void so thick that it seemed to devour the very air. The only sound was the pounding of their hearts in their ears and the heavy breathing of their companions, each of them too stunned to speak. It was then that they heard it. A faint scratching sound. A whisper. A soft, skittering noise, like claws dragging against stone. "Did you hear that?" one of them whispered, their voice trembling. Everyone froze. The air was heavy with something that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. They turned toward the sound, straining their eyes to pierce the darkness. The shadows shifted, and then, in an instant, something leapt out of the dark. A blur of movement. Fangs, claws, and a terrible screech filled the air. One of them screamed, the sound sharp and desperate. Before they were pulled into the abyss, their body yanked away by an unseen force. Another scream followed, then another as they were dragged, helpless, into the darkness. It happened too fast for any of them to react. No time to think, no time to even breathe. One by one, their friends were consumed by the dark. "Help! Someone help!" someone cried, scrambling desperately on the ground, but it was no use. Their cries faded as quickly as the darkness swallowed them. Only two of them remained, standing in the cavern of shifting shadows, their backs pressed against the stone walls, hearts racing with terror. The skittering noises had stopped for a moment, but they could feel them, moving in the dark just beyond the edges of their sight. It was like being hunted. They had no idea what was out there, but they knew one thing for sure: they weren't alone. And whatever was out there was getting closer. The second figure, still standing, still breathing, was frantic now, her hands trembling as she tried to find a way out. She pulled at the edges of her clothes, her fingers stiff with fear. The only thing they could do was move forward, to try to reach the farthest corner of the cavern. Her foot brushed against something cold, something wet. The other person, too terrified to speak, grabbed her arm and pulled her toward a narrow opening in the rock. It was barely visible, a crack in the stone that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light. It was the only way out, the only way to escape whatever hunted them. With every step they took, the shadows seemed to grow deeper, to pull them further into the abyss. The ground beneath their feet was slick now, wet and cold, and the air was suffocating. The smell of decay and rot was thick in their noses, making it hard to breathe. Suddenly the ground trembled. A low, bone-shaking rumble reverberated through the cavern, and a voice, came from the very walls. "You can't leave." The voice wasn't human. It was something ancient, something far older than the lodge itself, an unnatural rasp that seemed to crawl out from the cracks in the stone. The air grew heavier with each syllable, as if the very cavern was speaking, breathing with them. They could feel the presence, the thing behind them now, just out of sight but closer than ever. Its breath was warm against their skin, and they could hear the wet sound of its movements, sliding across the rocks like a snake. With a gasp, they sprinted toward the narrow crack, their hearts pounding, their legs burning with exhaustion. Every step was a battle, as the world around them seemed to distort, to shift, as though reality itself was bending and breaking under the pressure of their fear. Just as they reached the crack, something grabbed the woman's leg. She screamed, her voice high and desperate, but the grip was like iron, impossibly strong. She tried to pull away, but the force dragging her back was unyielding, like she was being pulled into the depths of the earth itself. Her companion reached down, trying to grab her, to pull her free. But it was no use. She was slipping away, and the sound of claws scraping against the stone, grew louder and louder, drowning out her cries. "No! No!" she screamed, reaching for the edge of the crack with her last strength, but it was no use. The dark, vile thing was taking her, pulling her into the blackness, into whatever nightmare lurked beyond. The shadows were alive, hungry, and they would not be denied. With one final, terrified scream, the woman was gone, swallowed whole by the darkness. The last remaining figure stumbled backward, eyes wide in terror, heart hammering in his chest. The cavern felt like it was closing in, the walls bending, folding in on themselves, the air choking him, suffocating him. He turned and bolted into the narrow crack, scrambling desperately, trying to push through the jagged stone walls, but they wouldn't let him. The air seemed to tighten around him, like an invisible hand squeezing the life out of him. And then, in an instant, the walls of the crack disappeared. He was falling again. The fall felt endless, as if the very ground beneath him had been erased, replaced by an infinite void. There was no sound, no feeling of air rushing past, just the oppressive weight of the fall itself. The darkness consumed him completely, suffocating his senses until he wasn't sure if he was even alive. And then, thud, he hit something hard, something that jolted his body painfully, throwing his chest into his throat. He gasped for air, though it came in short, ragged bursts, as if the air around him had been sucked away by the force of his descent. He lay there, disoriented, the echoes of the fall still ringing in his head. His limbs were stiff, his back aching from the impact. Slowly, he pushed himself up, blinking against the dark, his senses still muddled by the surreal experience. His eyes strained, attempting to adjust to the stifling blackness that surrounded him. It felt as though the dark itself had substance, something thick and heavy that clung to him, pressing down on his chest. The ground beneath him felt wrong. Uneven, jagged, as though he were standing on bones. He hesitated to move, trying to make sense of his surroundings, but his vision was clouded by the dim light of a distant, flickering glow. He took a step forward, the ground shifting beneath him. His feet slid slightly on the slick stone floor, as if something wet, something alive, was coating it. He could feel it now, that creeping sensation, like eyes watching him, feeling his every movement. Then he heard it again. A low, scraping sound. It was soft at first, barely audible above the pounding of his own heartbeat. But it was there, scratching, sliding, like something dragging itself across the floor, closer and closer, and he was the prey. The sound grew louder, moving from one side of him to the other, as if it were circling. He could hear the wet, slithering noise of something unnatural, its movements erratic and jerky. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, his skin prickling with a primal fear. He turned slowly, but he saw nothing, only the vast, suffocating darkness that stretched endlessly in all directions. And then, there, the faint flicker of light again, a soft pulse in the distance, barely enough to guide him through the nightmarish labyrinth he'd fallen into. He stumbled forward, the unease gnawing at his gut. Every step seemed to bring him deeper into the unknown. The air grew colder with each passing moment, and the sense of being watched, observed from every corner, was overwhelming. His feet splashed against something wet, something thick like tar. He looked down, his heart stopping when he realized it wasn't just the ground that was slick, but the dark liquid that seemed to flow in sluggish streams around him. The liquid glowed faintly, faint tendrils of red weaving through the dark. It was like blood, but it felt wrong, too thick, too alive. He could feel it sticking to his shoes, dragging at him, pulling him deeper into the maze. Every instinct in him screamed to run, to get away from whatever this was, but his feet wouldn't move. Something was in control of his body now. The liquid was pulling him, guiding him toward the flickering light ahead. He reached it, a narrow passageway barely wide enough for him to fit through. The light came from a door at the far end, a small crack in the stone that let through a golden hue, shimmering with an unnatural warmth. For a moment he felt relief, a faint hope that maybe, just maybe, he could escape this nightmare. But then he heard it again, the scraping. Closer this time. The noise came from all around him, reverberating through the stone walls, echoing with an eerie, hollow tone. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, as if the very structure of the lodge was reaching out to consume him. And then they appeared. He didn't know what they were at first. Their bodies were twisted, unnatural, their features grotesque and malformed. Long, gangly limbs covered in damp, matted hair. Eyes, no sockets, empty and deep, with nothing but shadows crawling inside them. Their faces were pale, stretched taut, with a painful, inhuman grin that opened too wide for a human mouth. They didn't move at first. They just stood there watching him, waiting. But then, slowly, they began to shuffle forward, their limbs moving with a jerky, unnatural rhythm. The closer they got, the louder the scraping noise became, the sound of their fingers dragging against the stone, like nails on a chalkboard. His breath caught in his throat, panic surging as he realized they weren't just moving toward him. They were blocking the passage. He backed away, his mind racing for a way out, but the passageway was now flooded with the dark, writhing liquid. There was nowhere to go. The creatures, if they could even be called that, were closing in now, their movements slow, deliberate, like predators playing with their prey. One of them reached out, its long, bony fingers stretching toward him, the nails blackened and cracked. He ducked out of the way just in time, but his heart pounded in his chest faster and faster, as if it were trying to escape his ribcage. The air was thick with their presence. The stench of decay, of something rotting, filled his nostrils, choking him, making it hard to breathe. His back hit something, stone rough against his skin, and he realized with a sinking feeling that he had nowhere left to go. The creatures were closing in, moving faster now, their broken, twisted forms sprinting toward him with unnatural speed. The scraping noise was deafening now, filling his ears, and the walls themselves, seemed to be pressing in, narrowing the space. And then the door, the golden light, flickered. There was a crack, a sliver, and the moment it appeared, he felt something in the back of his mind, a deep, primal instinct that screamed for him to run toward it. Without thinking, he lunged for the light, his body moving on its own, driven by pure terror. The creatures shrieked, high-pitched, guttural cries that sliced through the air like knives, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. His body moved faster, fueled by sheer adrenaline. He reached the crack in the stone, and with a strength he didn't know he had, he shoved his body through, squeezing into the narrow space, the light blinding him as he tumbled into what felt like a new world. And then, for a moment, everything went silent. The light, no longer golden but a harsh, white light, blazed around him, and he was surrounded by an open space. A vast, cavernous room that stretched endlessly, with a high ceiling made of jagged stone. In the center, an altar, made of the same dark, wet stone, stood ominously. It wasn't over yet. He looked around, trying to catch his breath, but there was no comfort in this place. It was worse than the dark. It was empty in a way that made his skin crawl. A deep rumbling sound, as though the earth itself was stirring, vibrated through the ground. Something was moving, something large, shifting beneath the stone. And then the voice, that same low rasp that came from the walls. "You have entered the heart of the lodge." The words, "You have entered the heart of the lodge," echoed through the cavernous room like a whispered prophecy, each syllable dripping with a chilling finality. The ground beneath him trembled once more, a deep rumble that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. The air grew heavier still, thick with a malevolent force that made it nearly impossible to breathe. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, breathing, pulsing with a dark rhythm. The altar in the center of the room beckoned, its jagged stone surface slick with a wet sheen that reflected the harsh white light in an eerie, unsettling way. A sense of overwhelming dread washed over him, but it wasn't just the altar that held his gaze. It was what stood before it. A figure. It was barely visible at first, just a silhouette against the pale light, standing motionless in the center of the altar. As he blinked, trying to focus, the figure began to take shape, and what he saw made his heart stutter in his chest. It was tall, towering in fact, and its limbs were unnaturally long, stretching far beyond the proportions of a normal human. Its body was clothed in dark, tattered robes that billowed around it like smoke, and its face was something that no human mind could have ever conceived. It was a void, an absence of features, save for two glowing, hollow pits where eyes should have been. They shone with a sickly green hue, casting an otherworldly light across the room. The figure lifted its arms slowly, the motion deliberate, as if it were savoring the moment. And then, it spoke. The voice was not human. It was ancient, a deep rasp that seemed to reverberate from all directions, as if the words were coming from the very walls, the very earth beneath him. It was a voice that felt like it was carved from stone, cold and unforgiving. "Welcome to the heart of the lodge," it intoned, each word dripping with malice. "You who have wandered too far, who have embraced the darkness, will find only one path, the path of oblivion." A shiver ran down his spine. There was no warmth in the room, no comfort, only the cold, suffocating grip of terror that seemed to tighten around his chest with every passing second. The figure did not move, but its presence seemed to fill the entire space, growing larger with every breath. He took a tentative step forward, but the air around him thickened as if pushing him back. His limbs felt heavy, weighed down by the oppressive force that emanated from the figure. "What are you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, drowned out by the rising pulse of the lodge around him. The figure's hollow eyes glowed brighter, flickering like dying embers, and for a moment he thought he could hear the faintest sound, an almost imperceptible whisper. It was coming from the walls, the stone, the very foundation of the lodge itself. "I am the keeper," it replied, its voice smooth and cold. "The keeper of all that has been buried here. The keeper of the darkness that sleeps beneath the earth. You who seek to escape have only come closer to the truth." The truth. The word struck him like a physical blow, and for a moment he faltered. What truth? What was this place? What was this lodge? He had thought it was merely a place to stay, a quaint, dilapidated retreat hidden deep in the woods, but now it seemed like so much more. It was alive. It had always been alive, waiting for him, for them. The figure's eyes narrowed slightly, the glowing green orbs flickering as if it could hear his thoughts. The air became even colder, and a sudden wind swept through the chamber, carrying with it the scent of decay, of rot. "You wish to know the truth?" the figure asked, its voice dripping with disdain. "You wish to know what lies beneath? Very well. You will find what you seek, but be warned, it comes with a cost." Before he could respond, the walls of the cavern seemed to pulse, the very stone trembling. The ground beneath him cracked open, and a dark, inky substance began to seep from the fissures, pooling in the center of the room, swirling around the altar like a living thing. It wasn't just liquid, it was alive. He could feel it in his bones, a primal fear that surged through him, urging him to run, to escape before it consumed him. But he was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to break free from the hold the figure had on him. His vision blurred, and he felt himself being pulled toward the altar, drawn to it as though some unseen force were dragging him forward. The swirling liquid around him seemed to grow more intense, pulling at his clothes, his limbs. "Look upon it," the figure commanded. "See what has been hidden from you. See the truth of this place." And then, without warning, the liquid surged upward, crashing against the altar, and a blinding light exploded from within it. The light was so intense, so pure, that it seared his eyes, forcing him to look away. The heat radiated outward, scorching his skin, but he couldn't pull away. He was trapped, caught in the swirling vortex of light and darkness. As the light receded, he saw it. The truth. What had once been a simple altar was now a massive structure, a towering black monolith that seemed to stretch endlessly upward, reaching into the very heart of the lodge. It was covered in intricate carvings, symbols, runes, and sigils that seemed to writhe and shift with an unnatural life of their own. Each symbol was alive, moving like liquid ink, constantly changing shape, never settling. And then, the eyes. At the very top of the monolith, carved into the stone itself, were two massive, hollow eyes. They were the same as the figures, glowing with that sickly green light, staring down at him with a hunger that made his stomach churn. "This is the heart of the lodge," the figure intoned. "This is the place where the darkness resides. It is the source of all that you have seen. The whispers, the shadows, the horrors that have hunted you, they are but servants. They are the keepers of the gate. And you, wanderer, are the key." His heart pounded in his chest, panic rising. He wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but the words caught in his throat. The truth was unfolding before him, and he had no control over it. He was nothing more than a spectator in this twisted play, a pawn in a game far older than he could understand. "You," he choked, his voice hoarse. What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, the motion smooth and unnatural. "I want nothing from you," it replied. "But you have already given yourself to me. You have entered the heart, and now you must serve the lodge. You will take your place with those who came before you, those who were consumed by the darkness. You will become one with it." His stomach turned at the thought. The screams, the clawing, the faces that had come before him, all of them trapped in the lodge, bound to it forever. But there was something else, something he couldn't quite grasp. There was a way out, a way to escape. He turned his head to the side, his eyes falling on the crack in the stone, the flickering light beyond it. It was faint now, nearly gone, but it was there. The only path forward, the only chance he had. But the figure saw it too. It lifted its hand, and the stone cracked open, the ground shifting violently beneath him. The monolith began to pulse, its eyes glowing brighter, and the liquid began to swirl again, this time pulling toward the altar, swirling around him, closing in. "Escape is not for you," the figure intoned, its voice rising in a terrible crescendo. "The heart has claimed you. You are mine now." And with that, the walls of the lodge seemed to close in around him, the air becoming suffocating, the darkness pressing against him, pulling him down into the very core of the lodge. His vision blurred, the last remnants of light fading as the dark swallowed him whole. The last remnants of light vanished, leaving him in absolute darkness. The sensation of falling had returned, though he wasn't sure if he was truly moving. It felt like time had dissolved, stretching infinitely, pulling him through an endless void. Every sense in him screamed for clarity, for escape, but there was only darkness, only that oppressive pressure that weighed on his chest. And then, a sudden crack. The world snapped back into place. The darkness shattered, and with it came the air. The stale, rancid air of the heart of the lodge, the very essence of the place itself. It was thick and pungent, cloying like rot, as if the air had been festering for centuries. He gasped, his breath ragged, his lungs burning as though he had been starved of oxygen. His body ached, his head spinning as he tried to orient himself. He was on the ground, but it was no ordinary ground. It was soft, shifting like something alive, a writhing, slick surface that pulsed beneath him. He could feel it in his bones, a subtle vibration that resonated deep inside him. Panic surged again, but he forced himself to open his eyes, though it took every ounce of willpower. What he saw was worse than anything he could have imagined. The walls were alive. Not in the way a living organism moves, but in the way something unnatural does. The walls weren't just stone anymore, they were organic. Flesh-like veins snaked across the surface, throbbing with a dull, sickly light. Each vein pulsed with rhythmic precision, as if the lodge itself were breathing, alive in a way that defied reason. And at the center of it all, the monolith. It loomed above him, far too large, its black surface rippling like liquid. Its eyes, those horrible empty eyes, were fixed on him, watching him with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the very core of his soul. He tried to move, to crawl away, but his limbs felt heavy, sluggish. The liquid underfoot seemed to drag at him, its viscous texture slowing his every attempt to escape. You cannot escape. The voice, that voice, came again not from the figure but from the very stone itself. It reverberated through the walls, through the air, and into his very thoughts. He could feel the force of it pressing against his mind, smothering his resistance. The monolith shifted, its surface distorting, and from within it emerged tendrils, long, twisting appendages of shadow and substance. They slithered toward him, their movements deliberate, almost tender, as though they were reaching for him like the hands of an old, forgotten lover. You are already a part of it, the voice continued, each word dripping with malevolence. The lodge claims all who enter, and now you are no different. You will never leave. You will become part of this place, and this place will become part of you. The tendrils wrapped around him, cold and unyielding, pulling him closer to the monolith. It was as if they were threading themselves through his body, wrapping around his limbs, his torso, his mind. No, the thought screamed in his head. I won't let it happen. But his body betrayed him. It was as if the lodge itself was taking control, bending him to its will. He tried to fight, to thrash, but the tendrils squeezed tighter, and with each passing second, it became harder to think, harder to breathe. It was as if the very essence of the lodge was taking root in him, spreading through his veins, suffocating him. He looked up at the monolith, its eyes staring down at him, unblinking as the voice continued, low and rumbling. You will see. You will understand. Suddenly, the world around him began to warp. The monolith seemed to dissolve, its black surface melting away like wax, revealing something far worse beneath. It wasn't just stone. It was flesh, organic, pulsating, and alive, with veins crisscrossing over its surface, glowing faintly in the same sickly hue as the eyes. As the monolith melted, the walls of the cavern began to shift as well. The stone twisted and contorted, bending like soft clay, and from the twisted mass of rock emerged figures, shadowy, indistinct shapes, their forms flickering and shifting with every passing moment. They were the souls of the lodge, or perhaps they were something worse, things that had once been human but had been twisted into something monstrous, something primal. Their eyes glowed with that same green fire, their faces contorted in agony, as though they were trapped in an eternal scream. Their limbs were unnaturally long and twisted, their mouths opened wide in silent cries, their bodies jerking and twitching in spasms. And then they began to move. Not toward him, not yet, but toward the edges of the cavern, toward the far walls where the tendrils of the lodge stretched out, slowly consuming everything in their path. The figures slithered and crawled, moving with unnatural speed, like insects on a rotting carcass. They are the keepers, the voice murmured. They were once like you, wanderers, seekers of the truth. Now they are part of the lodge. They are the past, the present, the future. The figures vanished into the darkness, leaving behind an oppressive silence that hung heavy in the air. But as quickly as the silence came, the tendrils began to tighten around him again, pulling him upward, lifting him toward the monolith. His body felt like it was being stretched, his limbs pulled apart, his soul ripped from his body. "Do you feel it?" The voice whispered. "The binding has begun." The monolith's eyes flashed, its glow intensifying. And then, a terrible cracking sound. The stone, the flesh, split open, revealing a dark, yawning chasm. A void that stretched into infinity. He could feel the pull, as if the very essence of the lodge was dragging him into that abyss, into the heart of the darkness that had claimed so many before him. And then the realization hit him. The lodge didn't want to consume him. It didn't want to end him. It wanted to bind him. The figures weren't its victims. They were its guardians, trapped in eternal servitude, bound to the lodge, to its will. And now the lodge had marked him. He was to become one of them. The tendrils began to invade his mind, his thoughts becoming muddled, his will weakening. His body no longer felt like his own. His vision blurred as the darkness threatened to consume him, to tear apart everything that made him human. And then something snapped. A crack in the dark. A voice. A memory. A flash of light. He wasn't alone. His companions. They were still somewhere within this place. They were not gone yet. He fought back. The tendrils that had twisted around his arms began to unravel, his limbs shaking as he tore at them. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, his chest rising and falling in desperate rhythm. He wasn't finished. Not yet. Not yet. The tendrils seemed to pulse with a malevolent rhythm, tightening around his limbs, but his mind flared to life with an intensity he hadn't felt before. The overwhelming darkness clawed at his thoughts, but deep within him, buried beneath the terror, beneath the suffocating grip of the lodge, there was a flicker of defiance. It was small, fragile, like the embers of a dying fire, but it was enough. He twisted his arm, forcing his hand free from one of the tendrils, ignoring the burning sensation as the flesh around it cracked and tore. The pain was nothing compared to the feeling of the lodge pressing into his very soul, trying to smother him from within. It was as if the air had become a liquid, heavy and oppressive, and each breath was like trying to inhale the very walls of the lodge itself. The monolith loomed above him, its eyes still fixed on him, glowing with that sickly green light, watching his every move. Its surface rippled as if it were alive, its dark veins pulsing in time with his heartbeat. The lodge was watching him, waiting. He could feel it. It wanted him to break. It wanted him to succumb to the darkness, to become one with it, to join the endless cycle of suffering and servitude. But he refused. With a sharp grunt, he pulled his other arm free, his body shuddering as the tendrils recoiled from his skin like a snake struck by venom. The crackling force that held him in place seemed to waver for a moment, just enough to give him the leverage he needed. He wrenched himself upward, rising on shaky legs, his body trembling with exertion. The lodge groaned, a deep, unsettling sound that seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the earth. The walls quivered, the stone creaking and shifting, as if it were angry, as if it were responding to his resistance. He could hear whispers now, voices from the past, voices of those who had been claimed by the lodge before him. "You cannot escape," one whispered, its tone soft and pleading. "We are all bound here, all of us. You will become like us," another voice rasped, this one low and guttural, filled with despair. "We are the keepers, the guardians of the lodge. You will never leave." The voices echoed through the chamber, their words pressing into his mind, trying to shatter his resolve. But he shook them off, focusing only on the distant crack of light, the door. He had to reach it. He had to escape. He staggered forward, his feet slipping on the slick, pulsating ground, but he forced himself to keep moving. The lodge seemed to fight him with every step, the air thickening, the ground buckling beneath him. The light from the crack grew brighter, a faint golden hue that cut through the darkness, a beacon of hope, no matter how small. "Don't listen to them," a voice, his own, screamed in his mind. It was a voice that wasn't his own at all, but a part of him, a part he hadn't known was there. It pushed through the fog of the lodge's influence, urging him forward. "Don't stop." He reached for the crack, his hand brushing against the cold stone, and with a final desperate push, he dove through it, throwing his body into the narrow passageway. The moment he passed through, the grip on him loosened. The tendrils recoiled as though they were retreating from him. The oppressive pressure in the air lifted, and for the first time since entering the lodge, he could breathe, really breathe, without feeling the weight of the place crushing him. But the danger was far from over. He found himself in a new chamber, smaller but no less sinister. The air was thick with dust and decay, and the ground beneath him was dry, cracked, covered in strange symbols and runes. The walls were covered in ancient markings, carvings that seemed to shift and pulse as if alive. There was no light here, save for the faint glow of his surroundings, but it was enough to see the large stone door at the far end of the chamber. It was his only way out. But before he could make his move, the air shifted again. A sound, a low, groaning creak, came from behind him. It was like the lodge itself was shifting, moving, changing, its walls twisting and folding in on themselves. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and from the shadows emerged a figure, tall, gaunt, and unmistakably alive. He froze. The figure was one of the guardians, one of the souls who had been claimed by the lodge. It stood motionless at first, its form flickering in and out of existence, as if it were partially made of shadow. Its eyes were hollow, empty pits, but they glowed with the same green fire as the monolith. And its mouth was a twisted, jagged line, stretched wide in a permanent grin that showed too many teeth. "You cannot escape," the figure said, its voice a low rasp that scraped against his mind. "You will never leave this place. The lodge claims you now. You are mine." The air seemed to freeze, and he could feel the pressure building around him once more, the walls drawing closer, the space shrinking. The figure took a step forward, and with each step, the temperature dropped. His breath came out in clouds of mist, but he didn't move. He couldn't. He had to make a choice. He had already fought against the pull of the lodge, and now it was his final test. Fight or submit. A memory flashed before him. His companions. He remembered their voices, their faces, their fear. They had been here. They had been taken. He could almost hear their screams, muffled beneath the weight of the stone, beneath the pulse of the lodge. They were gone, consumed by the darkness. But they were still there. Somewhere. They had to be. He couldn't let them be lost to this place forever. Without thinking, without hesitation, he turned toward the stone door and ran. The figure's laughter echoed through the chamber, cold and hollow, but he didn't stop. His legs burned with every step, his mind focused solely on the door. The stone beneath his feet cracked and splintered as he ran, the shadows stretching around him, trying to pull him down, but he kept moving, faster and faster, as if the very act of running could break the spell. He reached the door, his hands slamming against it. The cold metal pressed against his palm, and he felt the pulse of something alive, on the other side. The door was alive too, but he pushed anyway. He shoved his shoulder into the door, the wood groaning, the metal squealing as it gave way, just enough for him to slip through. And with one final breath, he shoved the door open, stumbling into the unknown. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening thud, but the sound did little to reassure him. It was as if the entire structure of the lodge were groaning in protest, the walls vibrating under the weight of some unseen force. He stood there for a moment, gasping for breath, his chest heaving as the adrenaline surged through his body. His heart was still hammering in his chest, the echo of the figure's hollow, mocking laughter still ringing in his ears. He forced himself to turn around, to face whatever had come through the door with him. The chamber beyond was dark, too dark. It felt colder, more oppressive than anything he had experienced before. The shadows seemed to creep and coil at the edges of the space, whispering to him, beckoning him deeper into the darkness. But he didn't have time to contemplate the horrors that lurked within. With a sharp intake of breath, he sprinted forward, his feet stumbling on the uneven ground. His legs were stiff, his body sore from the tendrils that had torn at his skin, but he couldn't stop. There was no time. The lodge was closing in, it always closed in, and the figure, the guardian, it would find him again no matter how far he ran. He needed to escape. The walls of the chamber seemed to stretch outward as he ran, the space expanding and contracting like a living thing. Every step he took felt like he was running through thick mud, his movements sluggish, as though the very air was working against him. The darkness seemed to pulse, an oppressive weight pressing down on his shoulders, on his chest, trying to crush him with each breath he took. And then he saw it, a faint light, a flickering from far down the hallway. It wasn't much, but it was enough to guide him. The flicker grew brighter as he pushed forward, the light becoming more defined. It wasn't a warm, welcoming light. No, it was cold, sharp, almost sterile, but it was a light, and that was all that mattered. He was almost there when he heard it again, the scratching. the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against stone. He didn't dare look back. His legs burned with every step, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he closed the distance between himself and the light. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in on him with every passing second. The scratching grew louder, closer. It was behind him now, following him, relentless. His fingers brushed the cold stone of the wall as he pushed himself faster, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel it, feel the presence, something just behind him. A shadow, a figure moving, crawling, slithering, hunting. The light was just ahead. He reached it. With a final push, he threw himself through the narrow archway, stumbling into the next room. This room, however, was different. The walls were made of polished marble, gleaming in the cold, sterile light. The floor beneath him was smooth, slick with something dark, something wet. His feet slid as he tried to regain his balance, but it was no use. The ground seemed to shift beneath him, as though the very foundation of the lodge were alive, moving, twisting. And there it was, the creature. It emerged from the darkness, its form barely visible at first, like a shadow stretching out of the very walls. But then it stepped into the light and he froze. It was the guardian, a twisted, corrupted figure. Its body was long and thin, elongated like a spider's, its limbs far too long for any human shape. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was a sickening parody of humanity. Its skin was slick and stretched, thin, so taut that the veins beneath it seemed to pulse with a dark, unnatural life. Its eyes, those terrible empty eyes, were wide, their green glow cutting through the darkness. But worse than its eyes was its mouth. A jagged, gaping wound that stretched impossibly wide, filled with teeth, sharp, cruel, and far too many. It let out a low, guttural hiss, its mouth twisting into a grotesque smile as it began to advance toward him. No. He staggered backward, his feet slipping on the slick surface beneath him. The creature's eyes never left him, its movements unnervingly smooth, as though it had all the time in the world to savor its hunt. It was like a spider stalking its prey, circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. His back hit the wall, and he realized with a sickening twist in his stomach that there was nowhere to go. The room was closed off, no exits, no windows, just smooth, polished stone, as if the lodge itself had sealed him in, trapping him with the thing that would end him. He tried to breathe, tried to calm the panic rising in his chest, but it was no use. The creature was too close. The shadows around him seemed to stretch and pull at his limbs, tightening, constricting. It hissed again, its voice raspy, low, as if it was savoring every second. "You belong to the lodge now," it whispered. "You will never leave." The words were a curse, but they weren't a threat. They were a promise. But there was something deep inside of him that refused to give in. He was not a part of this, he would not be. There was still a flicker of resistance, a spark of defiance that he clung to, something far stronger than the terror. The creature's long, skeletal fingers reached out, but in that instant he felt it. The pulse, the beat, the energy from the walls, from the very ground beneath him, something shifting. He didn't know where it came from, but it was like an instinct, a pull, a surge of power that surged through his body, filling him with strength. His hands clenched into fists, and with a roar, he lashed out at the creature. His fist collided with its face, and for a moment, the creature staggered backward, its mouth snapping shut in surprise. But the power he felt was fleeting. The creature recovered quickly, its eyes narrowing with a mixture of annoyance and hunger. No, he needed more. He couldn't give up. His eyes darted around the room looking for anything to help. And then he saw it. A sharp, jagged piece of stone, half buried beneath the slick, dark liquid that covered the floor. It wasn't much, but it was something. Without thinking, he lunged for it, his fingers wrapping around the shard of stone. It was cold, jagged, perfect. The creature hissed again, advancing, but this time he was ready. With a swift, desperate movement, he swung the shard at the creature's throat. It was like cutting through glass. The creature howled, its voice rising to a shrill pitch, but he didn't stop. He twisted the stone in his hands, pushing it deeper, feeling the resistance as it slid through its flesh. The creature's eyes widened, its mouth opening in a silent scream, but it was too late. With a final, brutal twist, he ripped the stone from its body, and the creature collapsed into the dark, the shadows swallowing it whole. For a moment all was silent. The lodge seemed to hold its breath, the air still, thick with the scent of blood and decay. He stood there, trembling, his body covered in sweat, his mind racing, his pulse still hammering in his ears. But there was no time for rest. The battle wasn't over. The lodge would never let him go. The room was quiet, too quiet. For a moment, he dared to believe that it was over, that the relentless hunt had finally come to an end. He stood there, frozen, staring at the spot where the creature had fallen. The shadows around him seemed to pulse, as if the lodge itself were still alive, still aware of him, waiting for him to make his next move. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a foul, almost metallic scent that clung to his clothes, his skin. His breath was ragged, his chest heaving with the exertion of the struggle. He wiped his hand across his forehead, but it came away slick with sweat, his mind spinning from the terror, the fight, the overwhelming pressure of the lodge that seemed to close in on him with every passing moment. But there was no time to recover, no time to pause and catch his breath. The creature, or whatever it had been, was gone, vanished into the dark, swallowed by the very shadows it had come from. But even as he stood there, his legs shaking beneath him, a new realization began to creep into his mind. He had not truly defeated it. He had only delayed it. The creature was a part of the lodge just as he was. It could return. It would return. And then it hit him. The lodge wasn't just some forsaken building deep in the woods. It was something far more sinister, far more ancient. Something alive. Something horrible. He glanced around the chamber, his eyes searching for any signs of escape, but there was none. The walls seemed to ripple, as though they were breathing, expanding and contracting like a living organism. The hallway behind him was now gone, swallowed by the living stone. There was no way back, no way forward. He was trapped. A low hum began to reverberate through the air. It was soft at first, barely perceptible, but then it grew louder, louder, deeper, like the pulse of a heart beating beneath the floor, beneath the very walls. The hum grew louder still, as though the entire lodge were coming alive, vibrating with a dark, oppressive energy. And then he heard it. A voice. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was louder, more defined, and yet still faint enough that he wasn't sure if it was in his mind or if it came from the walls themselves. You will never leave. The words were cold, final. A decree. And with them came the unmistakable feeling of a presence. Something massive, ancient, and hungry. The walls trembled, the air thickened, and he could feel the energy of the lodge pressing in from all sides. The pulse of the heart, the true heart, was drawing closer. His pulse quickened, his thoughts racing. The way forward wasn't through the walls. It wasn't through the corridors. He realized now that the very core of the lodge was alive, and the path to escape, to freedom, lay deeper within. But how? How could he even hope to reach it? And what would he find there? Suddenly, the floor beneath him gave way, the stone cracking and splitting like brittle bone. He was falling again, falling into the heart of the lodge. The descent was faster this time, as if the lodge were pulling him, dragging him downward into its very core. The walls around him shifted, the stone groaning as he plummeted deeper, his body twisting with the motion. He reached out, trying to grab onto something, but the walls were slick, the air thick with an invisible force that kept him from finding purchase. The fall felt endless. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The ground below him was soft, too soft, and he crumpled into it, his body slamming against the surface that felt like wet earth, but not quite. He could feel the vibrations beneath him like a heartbeat, a deep heartbeat. He lay there for a moment, disoriented, breathing heavily, his mind spinning from the rapid descent. When he finally managed to push himself up, he realized where he had landed. The chamber was vast, too vast. It stretched beyond his vision, disappearing into the darkness. The air was thick with an unnatural warmth, heavy and stagnant, like the air of a tomb that hadn't been disturbed for centuries. His feet sank slightly into the ground, which was soft and yielding like damp earth, but he could feel the unmistakable pulse of something alive beneath the surface. The heart of the lodge. He stood up slowly, taking cautious steps forward, his every movement careful, deliberate. The oppressive heat made it difficult to breathe, but the air wasn't quite suffocating. There was something wrong about it, something that didn't belong in the natural world. The ground beneath him felt alive, and it was as if the very stone, the earth itself, was breathing with him. And then he saw it. A massive, pulsing mass in the center of the room, a black, writhing mass of tendrils, veins, and flesh, stretching upward like the roots of a tree, but far darker, far more sinister. It was as though the heart of the lodge itself had grown to fill the space, an organic, living thing that stretched endlessly into the darkness. The veins that wrapped around it glowed with an eerie green light, pulsating in time with the beat of the heart. The center of the lodge, the core. He took a step forward, but the ground beneath him shifted again, and he stumbled, barely catching himself. The pulse, the heartbeat, grew louder, faster, as though it were aware of him, sensing his presence. The veins in the walls seemed to react to his every movement, stretching, contracting, as if they were reaching for him. Something whispered in his ear, the voice cold and ancient, coming from the very walls. "You are mine now. You will never leave." He gritted his teeth, trying to block out the voice, but it was impossible. The weight of the lodge's influence was crushing him, suffocating him, pressing down on his very soul. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't give in. Not now. Not after everything. He forced himself to stand taller, to move closer to the mass at the center of the room. His every instinct screamed at him to turn and run, to escape while he still had a chance. But he knew better now. Running would only lead him further into the lodge's trap. The only way out was through it. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the cold, slick surface of the tendrils. It was alive, pulsing with a sickening, organic rhythm. As his fingers made contact, he felt a jolt of energy, raw, dark, and powerful, course through him. His body jerked, and for a moment, he felt as if the very essence of the lodge was flowing into him, pulling him deeper into its grasp. "You belong to me," the voice whispered again, louder this time. "You are mine." He fought against the surge of energy, gritting his teeth as he fought to maintain control over his own mind. The pulse of the heart was overwhelming, its influence pushing against his thoughts, threatening to swallow him whole. But deep within him, something still burned. A flicker of resistance, a last shred of defiance. He wasn't going to be another lost soul, another mind bound to the lodge. He slammed his fist into the mass of tendrils, feeling the strange, slick surface beneath his knuckles. The pulse of the heart shuddered violently, the walls vibrating with the force of it. And then, for a brief moment, everything stopped. The heart, the pulse, the shadows, they all seemed to freeze. The world held its breath. And then a crack, a loud, sickening crack, sounded from the heart of the lodge. The tendrils recoiled, retracting into the mass as if something had disrupted their connection. Something had changed. The air around him shifted. The whispers of the lodge, the voices that had clawed at his mind, became erratic, distant, as if the lodge itself were faltering. He didn't understand it, but he didn't care. This was his chance, and he wasn't about to waste it. The pulse of the heart seemed to shudder, as though the very walls of the lodge were gasping for air, as if the darkness within it had been temporarily disturbed. For the briefest moment, there was a sense of quiet, a strange stillness that hung in the air like a suspended breath. It was as if the lodge, for the first time since he had entered, hesitated, its grip loosened, if only slightly. He took the opportunity, seizing it with desperation, pushing himself forward, deeper into the core of the lodge. The mass of writhing tendrils recoiled slightly, as though recoiling from his defiance, but the heartbeat, that dark, relentless heartbeat, grew louder, faster. The pulse quickened in time with his own, a maddening rhythm that filled his mind, pressing against his temples, threatening to drown out his thoughts. The tendrils, no longer so sluggish, began to inch closer again, moving with a greater urgency, their slick, black bodies glistening in the dim light that surrounded them. Their movements were alien, unnatural, as if they were drawn to him in a way that he couldn't fully understand. As he reached forward, his fingertips grazing the surface of one of the larger tendrils, a jolt of cold electricity shot up his arm, and the walls of the chamber seemed to close in. The temperature dropped. A biting cold swept through the chamber, creeping through the cracks in the walls, seeping into his very bones. His breath came out in sharp, ragged bursts, but it didn't feel like cold air. It felt like something else, something far more sinister. It was the coldness of the grave, the coldness of something dead and long forgotten, the kind of coldness that speaks of rot, decay, and centuries of entombed darkness. And then the whispers returned. They were louder now, their voices growing from a faint murmur to a deafening chorus, 1,000 lost souls crying out in agony and despair. The voices echoed off the walls, reverberating through the air, pressing into his skull, into his mind. "You will not leave," they hissed. "We are eternal. We are the Lodge. You are nothing." He clenched his teeth, pushing through the searing pressure that threatened to crush him from all sides. The air felt thick now, heavier, as if the very weight of the Lodge was pressing down on him, seeking to pin him to the ground. He could feel the presence of the Lodge, watching him, waiting for him to collapse, to give in. But he refused. He had already come this far. He wasn't going to give up now. He had to find the core, the true center of the Lodge. The heart, the source of all its power. It was the only way to survive, the only way to escape. And so he pushed forward. The ground beneath him was slick, wet, as though it were alive. The soft, damp earth seemed to shift with each step, as though the very surface was shifting beneath him. The walls around him pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, their veins twisting and stretching like the arteries of some vast organic beast. Suddenly, a tendril shot out, its tip lashing toward him like a striking serpent. He barely managed to twist aside, feeling the tendril's cold surface brush against his arm, leaving behind a trail of searing cold. It recoiled, but the message was clear. Stay back. But he couldn't. He pressed on. The air grew thick, suffocating, as though he were submerged underwater. Each breath was a struggle, as if the very Lodge was trying to suffocate him. He could feel the walls moving closer, closing in, but his feet carried him forward, step after agonizing step. The tendrils swayed, watching him, tracking his every movement. And then, in the distance, he saw it. The heart. It was vast, far larger than anything he had imagined, its size beyond comprehension. It was like a massive, writhing mass of organic matter, a pulsing, living thing at the center of the room. It stretched upward, its tendrils twisting into the darkness above, and its veins glowed with that sickly, green light, pulsing like the beating of a heart. It was beautiful and horrific all at once. The heart was not just a physical thing. It was alive. He could feel it deep within his chest, a pull that threatened to draw him closer, to consume him. It was as though the very essence of the Lodge was connected to it, its power, its will. And then he understood. This wasn't just a Lodge. It was a being, a living, breathing entity that had existed for centuries, perhaps even millennia. It was alive in a way that defied all logic, all understanding. The Lodge wasn't just a building. It was a creature, a predator, drawing those who entered into its depths, feeding off their fears, their despair, until they were swallowed whole. And now it had him. The heartbeat grew louder, pounding in his chest like a drum, its rhythm taking control of him. The tendrils around him seemed to thrash in time with the pulse, their movements violent and frantic. The walls of the chamber seemed to close in again, the stone groaning as if the entire Lodge were alive, responding to his presence. "You cannot leave," the voice whispered again, the same voice that had haunted him from the beginning. It was everywhere now, filling his mind, his very thoughts. "We are eternal. We are the Lodge. You are nothing. You will never leave." The coldness of the air gripped him tighter, the tendrils closing in, tightening their hold. He tried to move, to break free, but his limbs were frozen, heavy like stone. His body felt numb, as if the Lodge were sinking into him, filling him with its essence. But then something else happened. Crack. A sharp, violent crack that echoed through the chamber, a sound so loud it made the ground tremble beneath him. The pulse of the heart faltered for a moment, and with it, the world around him seemed to freeze. The walls stilled, the tendrils recoiled, and the whispers faded into silence. He stood there, stunned, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried to comprehend what was happening. The air seemed to shimmer around him, like a mirage fading into nothing. And then he saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the room, cloaked in shadow. It was impossible to see clearly, the figure too far away, its shape distorted by the strange light that filled the space. But he could feel its presence, a presence that was both comforting and terrifying. The heartbeat faltered again, and the figure stepped forward, moving silently, its form shifting with the shadows. It didn't speak, but somehow he understood. The figure was not the Lodge. It wasn't a part of it, but it was here for a reason. "You can still escape," the figure whispered, its voice a soft, ethereal sound that seemed to resonate with the very air. "But only if you are willing to fight. Only if you are willing to sacrifice." The pulse of the heart quickened again, as if reacting to the figure's presence. The tendrils began to move again, slithering toward him, but this time he felt the weight lift. He felt stronger. Fight, and the lodge will release its hold on you, the figure said, its voice like a distant echo. But the price will be steep. There is always a price. The darkness seemed to pull tighter, but for the first time he felt hope. He wasn't trapped anymore. The figure had shown him a way. But what was the cost? The figure stood at the far end of the room, a silhouette wreathed in shadows, its presence more like a whisper than a solid form. It was both comforting and terrifying, and its voice echoed through the chamber, reverberating through his very bones. There is always a price, the figure repeated, its words hanging in the air like a curse. Every escape comes with sacrifice. Nothing is free, not even freedom. The tendrils of the lodge had stopped moving for the moment, as though they too were waiting, watching. The pulse of the heart slowed, its rhythm no longer frantic, but still steady, relentless. It was as if the entire lodge held its breath, waiting for him to make a decision. His mind raced. The figure had given him a choice, a way out, but it came with a cost. What was that cost? What did it mean to fight back against the lodge? And what could he possibly sacrifice to escape the horrors that awaited him? But even as those thoughts swirled in his head, something else was happening. He could feel it deep within his chest. The heartbeat of the lodge, the pulse of the heart, that ancient, insidious power that had claimed so many before him. It was drawing him in, pulling him toward it, its influence wrapping around his very soul. He couldn't stay here. Not now. Not when he had a chance. With a deep, steadying breath, he forced himself to move. His limbs felt stiff, sluggish, like they weren't his own. The air was thick with the presence of the lodge, heavy and suffocating, but he ignored it. His gaze never left the figure. It was the only thing that seemed real now, the only thing that offered any hope in this nightmare. "What is the price?" he asked, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. The figure didn't immediately answer. Instead, it moved, gliding across the floor with an eerie grace, its form shifting in and out of the shadows. The darkness seemed to bend around it, as though the figure was part of it, woven into the fabric of the lodge itself. "The price is not for me to tell," the figure replied, its voice cold, yet filled with an unmistakable sadness. "It is for you to understand. Only by choosing will you know." The air around him thickened, as though the figure's words had altered the very atmosphere. The pulse of the heart quickened again, a violent, insistent rhythm that vibrated through the floor, through his skin, through his very thoughts. The walls around him began to shift, their veins crawling, growing, expanding, as though the lodge itself were alive and responding to his presence. "Do you see?" the figure asked. "Do you see what this place is? What it has become?" He turned, his eyes scanning the vast, writhing expanse of the heart, the tendrils, the organic mass that stretched toward the ceiling, reaching for something that could never be reached. The veins glowed, pulsating with an unnatural light, casting shadows across the walls, the floor, his own body. It was as if the very lodge were breathing, living, consuming. But there was something more. He could feel it now, a presence within the mass, something that wasn't part of the lodge, something that was bound to it, something that had been trapped here for far longer than he had ever known. And it was fighting. The figure seemed to sense his thoughts, for it spoke again, its voice trembling with an emotion that he couldn't place. "The lodge is not just a place," it said softly. "It is a prison, a tomb for those who enter, a trap for the lost. But it is also a curse that feeds on the souls of those it traps, draining them, turning them into something else, something twisted." He couldn't fully comprehend what the figure was saying, but he understood one thing. The lodge was not just an ancient building, a haunted forest, it was something far older. It was a living thing, a creature of darkness, something that had been here long before he had ever set foot in its halls. "It feeds on fear," the figure continued, its voice growing darker, more strained. "It feeds on the despair of those who enter, on their broken will, their lost souls. And those who stay too long, those who are claimed, become part of it. They are swallowed by the heart, by the very core of this place." A cold shiver ran down his spine, and the shadows around him seemed to draw closer, as though the very darkness were reaching for him, eager to consume him. The figure's voice softened again, filled with a quiet, mournful sadness. "I was once like you," it whispered. "I was once human. But the lodge, it claimed me. It took me, and now I am bound to it. I am a part of its heart." The words hit him like a slap. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The weight of the lodge's power seemed to press in on him, its oppressive presence crushing him from all sides. And yet, at the same time, he felt a strange kinship with the figure, something that echoed deep within him. He understood. He felt it. The heart, the pulse, the lodge. He could feel it now deep inside, that pull. The pull that threatened to swallow him whole, to claim him as one of its own. He stumbled forward, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to fight. How do I fight it? He asked, his voice shaky, desperate. How do I defeat the lodge? The figure paused, and for a long moment there was silence. The heartbeat continued, steady and relentless, a drumbeat that echoed in his chest. And then the figure spoke, its voice heavy with the weight of centuries of suffering. You cannot defeat it. Not directly. But you can destroy its heart. You can sever the source of its power. Only then will the lodge lose its grip on you. Only then can you escape. He felt the pulse of the heart intensify. The air seemed to hum, crackle with a strange energy that he couldn't fully understand. The mass before him, the tendrils, the veins, all seemed to speak to him now, calling him forward, urging him closer. But the figure's next words shattered the fragile hope he had felt. But the heart is not just a physical thing. It is bound to the essence of the lodge, and destroying it will destroy everything. It will destroy the lodge, but it will destroy you too. The weight of those words hit him like a physical blow. Destroy the heart? Destroy the lodge? The very thought sent a surge of terror through him. To destroy the lodge would mean the end of everything. It was its heart, its soul, its foundation. To sever it, to kill it, would be to die. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, his heart pounding. He had a choice to make, stay and fight or leave and hope that something would remain. There was no easy way out. There never was. If you choose to fight, the figure said, its voice softer now, know that the price will be steep. You will lose everything you hold dear. Your memories, your sense of self. You will be forgotten, but you will be free. He stood there, trembling as the pulse of the heart echoed in his ears. His body shook with the weight of the decision. The figure was right. There was no turning back from this. Once he stepped forward, there would be no coming back. But he couldn't stay here. He couldn't live in the shadow of the lodge, bound to its heart forever. With a final breath, he stepped forward. There was no going back now. The weight of the decision settled upon him like a stone, pressing against his chest. He could feel it deep within him, the pull of the lodge's power, the pulse of its heart, urging him to stay, to surrender. But the figure's words echoed in his mind, louder than the heart's relentless beat. You will be free. Freedom. It was a word he had barely dared to hope for, something that had been slipping away from him with every passing hour in this forsaken place. He hadn't known true freedom since the moment he stepped through the lodge's doors. Now, standing in the heart of it all, he understood the cost. The lodge was not just a building. It was a prison, an alive, breathing, living entity that consumed those who entered, taking their souls, twisting their very essence into something new, something dark. And yet he still had a choice. He had the power to end it all, to sever the heart. But at what cost? His eyes turned toward the massive, writhing mass in the center of the room. The tendrils reached out like greedy fingers, slick with darkness, moving in time with the pulsing beat. The veins twisted and contorted, their eerie glow brighter, more intense with each passing moment. The heart was an abomination, alive, breathing, living, and yet it was the key to everything. Its destruction would destroy the lodge, but the destruction would come at a price. His life, his very essence. Could he do it? The figure seemed to understand his hesitation, its form flickering in and out of the shadows as it moved closer. The air grew colder still, the heartbeat intensifying as the figure spoke once more, its voice heavy with sorrow and ancient wisdom. The lodge is not just a place of darkness, the figure said, its voice breaking the silence. It is a reflection of all who enter it. It feeds on the broken parts of their souls, the shadows they hide, the things they fear. It grows stronger with every soul it takes, feeding on their despair, their regrets. And it is only through the heart that it all continues. Only by destroying the heart can you stop it. His mind raced, processing the figure's words. The lodge didn't just imprison the body, it trapped the soul, taking pieces of those who entered, feeding on their fears, their guilt, and their darkest memories. He could feel the weight of it all pressing on him, every decision, every mistake, every failure that had led him to this point. The lodge had taken everything from him already, stripping him of his sense of peace, his sense of self. It had fed on his fears, and now it sought to consume him entirely. But there was still hope. He reached out, his hand trembling as his fingers brushed against one of the tendrils. The moment his skin made contact, a jolt of cold rushed through him, sending a shockwave of pain through his body. His vision blurred as the energy of the lodge rushed into him, filling him with the darkness, the despair that had claimed so many before him. It was suffocating, overwhelming, and he could feel it trying to take him, to drag him into the same abyss. But he fought. He pulled his hand away, the energy dissipating into the air, but the weight of it lingered, pressing against him, seeking to pull him back into the darkness. His breath was shallow, his chest rising and falling with each painful inhale. But there was no time to rest. The heart was still alive, still pulsing, still growing stronger with each passing second. The figure moved once more, stepping toward the heart, its form flickering in and out of existence like a fading shadow. "You must be strong," the figure said, its voice gentle yet filled with a deep, undeniable truth. "You cannot hesitate. The heart is feeding off your doubt, your fear. The longer you wait, the stronger it becomes. It is the essence of the lodge, and the lodge has fed on every soul it has trapped. The moment you destroy it, you must be ready to face the consequences." Consequences. The word clung to him like a weight, and he could feel the reality of it pressing down, suffocating him. To destroy the heart, to sever the power of the lodge, it meant his soul would be lost, his memories erased, his identity wiped away like dust in the wind. But what was he truly holding on to? What was left to lose? He turned toward the heart again. The tendrils were reaching farther, closer now, their slick bodies swaying like serpents in the dark. The air around him grew thicker with each passing second, the pulse becoming a deafening roar in his ears. He could feel the power of the heart, the very lifeblood of the lodge, surging through the veins of the walls, through the ground beneath his feet. There was no turning back. He had made his choice. He stepped forward, his footfall heavy in the quiet, the pulse of the heart shaking the very ground beneath him. The air around him hummed with power, the atmosphere thickening, the pressure building as he moved closer to the source of all the darkness. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the tendrils reacted, recoiling in horror as though they knew what was about to happen. And then he reached the heart. It was vast, larger than anything he could have imagined, its mass pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. The veins that snaked around it glowed with an eerie green light, their glow casting long shadows on the walls. The very ground beneath him seemed to shudder, as though it was alive, writhing, moving with a will of its own. And in the center, the heart, the beating, pulsing core of the lodge, was waiting for him, a thing of nightmarish beauty and terror. He took a deep breath. With a cry, he lunged forward, his body shaking, every nerve screaming as he reached for the heart. His hands wrapped around the slick surface, cold and pulsating beneath his fingertips. The energy within it was overwhelming, a flood of raw, chaotic power surging into him, threatening to rip him apart. But he held on. The moment his hands made contact, the entire lodge seemed to scream. The walls shook violently, the ground cracked beneath him, and the air turned to fire. The heart throbbed with unnatural fury, its veins twisting and pulling, as if it were trying to draw him in, to consume him. The power surged through him like a violent wave, washing over him, tearing at his mind, his body. He felt his consciousness slipping away, his memories starting to dissolve, his very sense of self beginning to unravel. The lodge was pulling at him, trying to break him, but he refused to let go. His mind blurred, his thoughts slipping through his fingers like sand. The pulse of the heart, the energy of the lodge, it was overwhelming, consuming, and yet he pressed on, his fingers digging deeper into the heart, his body racked with pain. And then something snapped. The heart, the very core of the lodge, began to tremble violently. The veins that snaked around it cracked, splintering into jagged, glowing shards. The ground shook as if the entire lodge were coming apart, its very foundation crumbling beneath his feet. The heart let out a deafening roar, a sound that echoed through the very fabric of the lodge, shaking the walls, the air, the earth. The light that had filled the room flickered, dimming, and for the first time he saw it. The lodge, the source of its power, starting to die. It was crumbling, breaking apart, its tendrils recoiling in agony, its heart pulsing erratically as if it were gasping for breath. And then, in a final, violent explosion of light, the heart shattered. The force of the explosion knocked him backward, sending him crashing to the ground. The entire chamber seemed to collapse around him, the very walls of the lodge crumbling into dust, the pulse of the heart fading into nothingness. For a moment, everything was still. The silence was deafening. And then, with a final, sharp breath, he realized he was free. The silence that followed the destruction of the heart was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was the kind of silence that gnawed at the edges of his consciousness, a stillness so deep it felt as though time itself had stopped, as if the very fabric of the world had unraveled in the wake of the heart's destruction. He lay there, his body aching, bruised by the violent shockwave that had sent him crashing to the ground. His mind was hazy, disoriented, the remnants of the heart's raw, pulsing energy still echoing through his veins like a fading, distant thunder. The world around him felt distant, as if it were slipping away, leaving him suspended in a void, caught between the physical realm and whatever lay beyond it. He struggled to rise, pushing himself up onto his hands, but his limbs felt heavy as though they were made of stone. The world around him seemed to shift, bending and warping as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. He had done it. The heart was gone. The lodge was dying. But even in the midst of his victory, a deep, gnawing sense of loss clung to him, wrapping itself around his chest like a vice. There was something missing. Something that had been taken from him during the battle with the lodge. A part of himself, a piece of his very being, had been ripped away in the chaos of that final moment. He staggered to his feet, his body protesting every movement, and looked around. The chamber was unrecognizable. Where once there had been the massive, pulsating heart of the lodge, there was now only a void. The floor beneath him had cracked and shattered, the walls crumbling into dust, and the air was thick with the smell of burning wood, of rot, of decay. The tendrils that had once reached for him, seeking to drag him into the heart of the lodge, were now nothing but broken remnants, their twisted forms lying lifeless on the floor like discarded puppets. And the whispers, the maddening whispers that had filled his mind for so long, were gone. The voices that had tormented him, telling him he was nothing, that he would never escape, had faded into the ether. The lodge was dying, its very essence unraveling. But despite the victory, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence that had once been oppressive, that had pressed down on him like a weight, now felt suffocating, like a void that threatened to swallow him whole. He could feel the absence of the lodge's influence in his mind, but in its place, there was an emptiness, a hollowness that gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. He glanced down at his hands, his fingers trembling as he flexed them. The sight of them, his hands, felt distant, unfamiliar. He could still feel them, but there was something wrong, something missing. His connection to his body felt like it was fading, slipping away with every passing second. He could still see the blood on his hands from his battle with the tendrils, but it seemed as though the blood itself was beginning to fade, becoming less real, less tangible. It was as though the very essence of who he was, his identity, his memories, was slowly unraveling. Panic gripped him. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. What was happening to him? Why did it feel as though the lodge, even in its death, was consuming him? He had severed the heart, destroyed the source of its power, but at what cost? A distant rumble shook the air, the remnants of the lodge's collapse reverberating through the floor. The very ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble, as though the building itself was trying to pull him back, trying to reclaim what had been taken. The remnants of the lodge's power were still alive, still seeping into him, pulling at him from all directions. And then, through the haze of his disorientation, something else began to emerge. Something far darker, far more sinister than the lodge had ever been. A shadow rose from the depths of the crumbling room, its form shifting and swirling like smoke. It was intangible like a fog, but it radiated a presence, a cold, malignant presence, that seemed to fill the very air around him. He froze, his heart skipping a beat as the shadow began to take shape, coalescing into something more solid, something real. At first, it was hard to make out, just a flicker of movement, a distortion in the air, but then it solidified into a figure. Tall, dark. Its form was shifting, like a silhouette caught in the corner of his vision, impossible to focus on. And yet he could feel it deep in his bones. The figure stepped forward, moving with an eerie grace, its every movement sending waves of cold dread rippling through the air. He could feel its presence wrapping around him, suffocating him, drawing closer with every step. He tried to move, to run, but his legs were unresponsive. His body refused to obey. It was as though the shadow had reached into him, gripping his very soul. "You think you are free," a voice whispered, low, guttural, almost familiar, but not quite. It was a voice that seemed to come from every direction, filling the air around him, seeping into his mind. "But you are mine, all of you." The lodge does not relinquish its hold so easily. The figure stepped into the faint light, its form becoming clearer, though it remained a shadow, an impossibility. Its eyes glowed, pale, empty sockets, and it gazed at him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was a mass of shifting shapes, a patchwork of darkness that seemed to melt and reform, as if the very substance of the lodge had shaped itself into something otherworldly. He stumbled backward again, but the shadow followed, its movements impossibly fast, its presence suffocating. "You thought you destroyed the heart," the voice continued, its tone a low, mocking laugh. "You thought you killed the lodge. But the heart is not the source of the power. It is only a vessel, a gate, a link. And now that the heart is gone, I am free to roam. Free to take what was always mine." The shadow reached out, its long, grasping fingers curling toward him, and for the first time since he had entered the lodge, he felt real fear. Not the fear of the dark, not the fear of the unknown, but the horror of what this thing was. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a spirit. It was the very essence of the lodge, the dark, corrupted energy that had built it. It was the thing that had created the heart, the thing that had been feeding on him all this time. It was the lodge itself. "No," he whispered, his voice shaking. "No, you can't be." The shadow's laugh echoed, growing louder, more mocking. "I am everything the lodge was and everything it ever will be. The heart was just one piece, one step in the process. But now I will consume you whole." The shadow lunged forward, its fingers outstretched, and in that moment, he realized something terrible. The lodge had never truly been defeated. The heart had been destroyed, yes, but the true evil of the lodge had always been beyond the physical. It was a part of the land, a part of the earth itself, born from ancient rituals, ancient darkness that had seeped into the ground long before any human ever set foot here. And now it was here, in front of him. As the shadow's fingers reached for him, something deep within him stirred, something he had almost forgotten. A spark. A shred of the person he had been before this nightmare. He didn't know if it would be enough. He didn't know if it was even possible to fight back against this force. But he had to try. The shadow's fingers brushed his skin, and in that moment, the darkness surged within him. It was the final test. Could he reclaim what had been lost, or would he be consumed, lost to the very thing that had once trapped him? The air seemed to thicken as the shadow's fingers closed around him, the very substance of the lodge seeping into his body, filling his chest with an ice-cold dread. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in on all sides, a force so ancient, so all-consuming, it threatened to drown him in its depths. The very ground beneath his feet seemed to give way, the earth shifting and cracking as if the world itself were unraveling. The shadow's form was no longer shifting, no longer an impossible figure on the edge of his vision. It had become a towering presence, tall and foreboding, its pale, empty eyes staring into his soul with a hunger that was both terrifying and infinite. There was no escape, no place to hide. This was the end. But deep inside he refused to accept it. The voice that came from the shadow was not just a whisper now, it was a roar, a deafening, resonating cry that rattled the bones of the earth. The very fabric of reality seemed to bend and break as the words poured from it, a guttural growl that reverberated through the very stones of the lodge. "You thought you could escape," the voice hissed, its tone dripping with venomous amusement. "You thought you could break free from me, but I am the heart of this place. I am the very spirit of the lodge. And you are nothing but a passing shadow to me." The words cut through him, slicing into the very core of his being. His memories flashed before his eyes. The first night he had stepped into the lodge, the eerie feeling that had clung to him like a shadow ever since. It had all led to this moment, to this ultimate confrontation with the very entity that had woven itself into the fabric of his soul. The lodge had never been just a building, a place of twisted corridors and echoing whispers. It had been a creature, alive, hungry for the souls of those who entered. And now it was ready to claim him, to consume everything he was. Every shred of his identity, his past, his future, it would all be devoured, swallowed by the darkness. The shadow leaned closer, its presence so overwhelming that he could no longer feel the floor beneath his feet. He was weightless, floating in the oppressive darkness, trapped in a void between life and death. The tendrils of the lodge, broken and decayed as they were, seemed to reach for him, dragging the remnants of the lodge's essence toward him like a river of destruction. But even in the face of this unimaginable terror, he felt something else. A flicker. A pulse of defiance. He refused to be swallowed whole. Not by this, not by the lodge. With every ounce of strength he could muster, he tore his eyes away from the shadow's gaze, fighting against the pull of its dark power. The shadow's fingers were still curled around his body, but he could feel his own will, his own strength, rising up within him. He had come too far to fall now. He had fought through the suffocating despair of the lodge, fought through the terror and the darkness, and he wasn't about to let it all end here. "I'm not yours." His voice, though weak, rang out in the emptiness, trembling with the force of his defiance. "I am not yours," he shouted, his voice breaking the stillness that had gripped him. His hands, once limp at his sides, shot up, clenched into fists. The shadow recoiled for a moment, as if taken aback by the force of his defiance, but it quickly regained its composure, its eyes narrowing with contempt. "You are mine," it sneered, its form pulsating with a malevolent glow. "You always have been. From the moment you set foot in this place, you were bound to me. You cannot escape. Not now. Not ever." He felt its grip tighten, but there was a flicker, a flash of light deep within his chest. The spark of something he had almost forgotten. His essence, the part of him that was still whole. He clung to it with every ounce of strength he had left. "No," he whispered, but this time there was strength in the word. The shadow's grip faltered, the pressure lifting for just a moment. He used that moment, gathering every scrap of will, every bit of defiance that remained. The very air seemed to shimmer as he pulled from the depths of his soul, something that had been buried, locked away. The lodge had tried to consume him, to make him part of its twisted, suffocating power, but it could not claim everything. It had taken his memories, his sense of self, but it had never truly touched his will, his heart. The spark of life within him that had refused to die. With a scream, he forced himself to his knees, his fists crashing to the ground. The very floor beneath him cracked, splintering apart as though the earth itself was rejecting the shadow's influence. Energy surged through him, radiating from the very core of his being, and the shadow recoiled, its form warping as if it couldn't contain the force he was unleashing. "No," it hissed, a crack in its voice. "You cannot fight me. You are nothing. You are a memory, a ghost." He didn't care. He had no memory, no sense of self that remained in the way it had once been. But the essence of who he was, the soul that had once walked the earth free, was not gone. It was here, deep inside, burning brighter than the darkness of the lodge, stronger than the shadow that sought to devour him. He fought back with everything he had, summoning the force of his will, the essence of his life, and released it all at once. The energy exploded from him, blasting outward like a shock wave, crashing into the shadow, throwing it back with the force of 1,000 storms. The shadow screamed. It was a sound unlike anything he had ever heard. It was the sound of pure, unrelenting agony. The cry of a being torn apart, its very essence unraveling. And as the shadow writhed, its form cracking, its shape twisting like something fragile, he understood. This was not just the lodge's heart he was destroying. He was destroying the very soul of the lodge. The thing that had created it, the force that had given it life, the darkness that had been nurtured by the fears of those who had come before him. The walls of the lodge shook, and the ground beneath his feet cracked open wider. The very air seemed to tear apart, and the faintest sliver of light pierced through the darkness, something that had not been seen in the lodge for as long as he could remember. The heartbeat, the pounding rhythm that had haunted him, faded away, becoming a distant echo in the void. The shadow convulsed one last time, and with a final deafening roar, it shattered, its form dissolving into dust, scattering into the air like smoke. For a long moment the world stood still. The walls of the lodge were now nothing but ruins, a shattered carcass of what it had once been. The tendrils, the dark veins, the very essence of the lodge, all were gone, consumed by the force of his will. What remained was an empty, crumbling husk, an echo of a place that had once been alive. He stood alone, his chest heaving, his body trembling from the exertion. His breath was ragged, his mind still reeling from the sheer power of the battle he had just waged. But it was over. The lodge was dead, and he was free. But even as he stood in the ruins of the place that had sought to devour him, there was no triumph in his heart. There was no relief, no sense of peace. For the battle had not only been fought against the lodge, but against something much deeper, something within himself. The price had been paid. The cost of freedom had been steep. And as he stood there amidst the ruins, the truth of it weighed heavily on him. He had won, yes, but in that victory something had been lost, something that could never be recovered. His memories, his past, the essence of who he was, gone. He was free, but he was also lost. The ruins of the lodge lay around him, a vast and desolate landscape of shattered stone, crumbled walls, and twisted remnants of what had once been alive. The sky above, once an oppressive blanket of dark clouds, had finally begun to clear. Faint streaks of pale light pierced through the cracks in the heavens, casting long shadows on the ground. The air, thick with the scent of decay and burnt wood, now carried a faint whisper of something new, something hopeful. Yet, despite the beauty of the clearing sky, he felt no sense of triumph. The price of his victory hung over him like a cloud, dark and oppressive. He had destroyed the heart of the lodge. He had faced the shadow, the very soul of the place. He had fought back against the endless tide of darkness that had tried to consume him, and in the process he had lost himself. His hands shook as he tried to steady himself, feeling the emptiness inside, a hollow space where his memories should have been, where his identity once resided. His past, the experiences that had shaped him, the people he had loved, the life he had lived, gone. It was as if they had never existed, as if they had been erased from the very fabric of his being. He turned slowly, his gaze scanning the ruins of the lodge, as if expecting some piece of his past to return to him. The wind rustled through the broken trees around him, sending a chill through his bones. The forest beyond was silent, the birds and animals that had once filled it with life now strangely absent, as though they too had fled the scene of the lodge's death. For a moment he wondered if he had destroyed more than just the lodge. Had he eradicated everything? All that he had known, all that had been his life? Or was there still a chance for him to rebuild, to reclaim the parts of himself that had been lost? But there was no answer, only the silence of the world, the emptiness that echoed in his chest. The wind blew harder, pulling at the tattered remnants of his clothes, as though urging him forward. Where do I go from here? The question echoed in his mind, but it had no answer. He was free from the lodge, yes. Free from its dark influence, its suffocating grip. But what was freedom without a past? Without a purpose? Without a memory of who he had been? He looked down at his hands again, the skin still marked with the faint traces of his battle. The blood, the dirt, the scars. But the more he stared at them, the more they seemed to fade, becoming less real, less tangible. It was as if the very act of looking at himself was erasing him, as if the world itself was trying to make him vanish. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. He needed to move. He couldn't stay here, in the ruins of the place that had nearly consumed him. There had to be something beyond this, something waiting for him in the world outside. The forest stretched out before him, dark and impenetrable. The path that had once led him into the lodge was now a forgotten thing, lost beneath the rubble and the wreckage. The road ahead was unclear, shrouded in shadow and uncertainty, but it was the only path left. Without thinking, he began to walk. His footsteps were slow at first, uncertain, as though the very act of moving forward required more effort than he could muster. The weight of his loss, his forgotten past, pressed heavily on him, making each step feel like a mile. And yet, with every movement, something shifted inside him. It wasn't much, just a flicker, a spark of something that seemed to stir deep within him. It was the smallest of feelings, but it was something he hadn't felt in what felt like an eternity. Hope. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know what the future held. But with each step, he began to realize that perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the only way forward was to embrace the unknown, to face the future without the weight of the past holding him back. For the first time since the heart had been destroyed, the weight on his chest began to lift just a little. The emptiness inside him was still there, an aching void that he could not fill, but there was something else too. A glimmer of something, something he couldn't name. It wasn't his memories. It wasn't his past. But it was his. It was a part of him. A part that could never be taken by the lodge. a part that had always been there, even beneath the shadow of the lodge. The path stretched out before him, endless and uncertain, but it was his to walk, no one else's. The lodge had stolen his memories, but it could never steal his will. That he had kept, that he would never lose. He paused for a moment, his foot hovering over the ground. The wind whipped around him, the remnants of the storm still lingering in the air, but there was something new now. The oppressive darkness that had once clung to everything, that had seeped into the very walls of the lodge, had begun to fade. It wasn't gone. Nothing could ever completely erase what had happened here, but it was receding, slipping into the distance like a nightmare finally waking. The world was beginning to heal. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, feeling the air fill his lungs, his chest expanding with life. It was strange how such a simple thing, a breath, could feel so significant. It was the first breath he had taken that didn't feel heavy with the weight of the lodge. It was just air, just life. He took another step, then another, and with each movement he felt a little lighter. His body, though still weary, felt more grounded, more real. The emptiness inside him was still there, but it was no longer suffocating. He could live with it. He could learn to live with it. The trees around him began to stir, their leaves rustling in the wind. The forest, silent and dead just moments ago, seemed to awaken with him. The birds, the animals, the life that had once thrived in these woods, now slowly began to return, their calls piercing the stillness of the air. A soft light, pale and gentle, began to filter through the canopy above, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The path ahead, once dark and foreboding, now seemed less so. It was still a journey into the unknown, but it was his journey. And for the first time, he realized that perhaps that was all he needed. Not his memories, not his past, but a future, a path forward. A chance to find himself again, to rebuild from the ashes of the past. He glanced back at the ruins of the lodge one last time. There was nothing left but rubble, dust, and the echoes of the horror that had once lived there. It was over. The darkness had been vanquished, and with it, the curse that had bound him. He turned away, stepping forward into the forest, the path stretching out ahead of him, uncertain but filled with possibility. The forest around him whispered softly, the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of animals filling the air. The oppressive darkness that had once clung to the land had all but vanished, replaced by a quiet, peaceful stillness. Yet, as he walked deeper into the woods, each step carrying him farther from the lodge's crumbled ruins, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had irrevocably changed within him, something that would never be the same. The path ahead remained shrouded in uncertainty, but for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the unknown didn't terrify him. It beckoned. The future, once a shadow-filled labyrinth of fear and confusion, now seemed like a wide-open space, waiting for him to shape it. He didn't know who he was anymore, not in the way he had once known, with memories and names, faces and places. But perhaps, in a way, that was the point. He had been freed from the chains of the past. And in that freedom, he had a chance to create something new, something that was his and his alone. The world around him began to transform as he walked. The trees, once gnarled and twisted, now stood tall, their leaves a vibrant green. The ground beneath his feet, though still uneven in places, was soft, cushioned with moss and the remnants of autumn's leaves. The very air seemed to hum with life, a silent orchestra of nature awakening from a long, troubled slumber. Birds flew overhead, and he noticed a deer grazing in the distance, its elegant movements a symbol of nature's resilience. There was a quiet beauty in the forest now. It was a beauty that had been hidden beneath the layers of darkness the lodge had cast over it. Now, with the heart of the lodge destroyed and the shadow banished, the land was beginning to heal. The scars that had marred it, the twisted and rotting remnants of the lodge's influence, were starting to fade away. The forest was breathing again, and so was he. Each step he took felt more real than the last, the weight in his chest lightening as he moved further from the place that had held him captive for so long. The emptiness inside him, though still present, began to feel less oppressive, less like a hole and more like an open space. An opportunity. He had no memories of who he was, no recollection of his life before the lodge. His past, the people he had known, the experiences that had shaped him, they were gone, lost to the darkness that had consumed them. But something was rising in their place. A new identity, a new self. It was strange, this feeling of rebirth. He wasn't who he had been, not even close, but the raw truth of that was strangely liberating. In the absence of his past, in the absence of the people he had loved, he was free to become anything. No longer shackled to the regrets, the fears, or the guilt of his former life, he could create a new story for himself. A new life. But who would he be? That question lingered in his mind, heavy and elusive. Who was he now that everything he had once known had been stripped away? Who was he without his memories, without his history, without the knowledge of his own story? As the path wound its way through the forest, he realized that he didn't have to answer that question immediately. He didn't have to know who he was yet. Perhaps for the first time in his life, it didn't matter. He had time. Time to explore the world, time to feel the air in his lungs and the soil beneath his feet, time to discover who he was meant to be, not just based on what had been, but based on what he chose to become. He reached a clearing in the forest, a soft patch of sunlight filtering through the trees. The warm light bathed him, and for a moment he stood still, letting it wash over him. There was something sacred about this place, something peaceful, as if nature itself had welcomed him into its fold. He closed his eyes, letting the light settle on his skin, feeling the warmth seep into his very bones. In that moment, something profound happened. The emptiness inside him, a hollow space that had once seemed like an insurmountable chasm, began to soften. It wasn't gone, not completely, but it felt different now. Less a wound, more a blank canvas. Something waiting to be filled. The loss was still there, but it no longer controlled him. It no longer defined him. His mind wandered back to the lodge, to the shadow that had once sought to consume him. He had fought the darkness, battled the very essence of the lodge, and in doing so, he had not only defeated it but had reclaimed his own strength. He had faced the very thing that had haunted him for so long and come out on the other side, scarred but free. He didn't need to fight anymore. The lesson was clear now. He had the power to create his own path. The lodge, the shadow, it had been a reflection of his own fears, his own doubts, and his own inability to move forward. By destroying it, by breaking free, he had released not only the world from its grasp but also himself from the chains that had kept him trapped in his own mind. He could feel it now, the flicker of something new taking root inside him. It was a feeling of strength, of purpose. The world was wide open before him, waiting to be discovered, and it was his to claim. But it would not be easy. The path ahead was long, uncertain, and fraught with challenges. But he had already faced the greatest darkness of all, the very heart of the lodge, and survived. He could survive anything. The thought steadied him, filled him with a quiet confidence that he hadn't known he possessed. There were no more chains, no more shadows, just the road ahead. He moved forward again, the path winding deeper into the forest, the sunlight filtering through the trees in shifting patterns. The deeper he went, the more the world seemed to come alive around him. The birds, the rustle of the leaves in the breeze, the sound of distant water flowing, everything felt like it was part of a greater whole, a harmony he had been blind to before. He could feel the pulse of life in the air, the earth beneath his feet, and he knew in his heart that he was a part of it. He always had been. The question of his past still lingered, but it no longer haunted him. He no longer needed the memories to define him. What mattered was what he chose to do now, what he chose to become. And in this moment, as the forest around him whispered its ancient secrets, he realized that he didn't have to have all the answers. He didn't need to know everything. He only needed to be, and that was enough. As the days drifted by, the forest became more than just a place for him to wander. It became a part of him. Each step he took seemed to draw him deeper into the rhythms of the natural world, where time flowed differently, where the seasons whispered their secrets and the earth beneath his feet felt alive with ancient energy. He was no longer just a man walking through the woods. He was one with it, a traveler moving through an ever-shifting landscape that seemed to pulse with life, with memories, with meaning. Every morning, the sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting long golden rays that sliced through the trees, bathing everything in a soft, ethereal light. The air was always fresh, crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. And in the quiet of dawn, as the first rays of light kissed his face, he would pause, standing still, letting the world wake around him. The birds began their songs, the animals stirred from their dens, and the wind picked up, carrying the sounds of far-off streams and rustling leaves. Each moment was precious. Each breath felt like a gift, and with it, the growing realization that he was no longer bound to the past. No longer a prisoner of the memories that had once defined him. His past was still gone, lost in the shadows of the lodge, but what had replaced it was not emptiness, but possibility. He had walked away from the ruins of the lodge not just physically, but spiritually. The place where the heart of the lodge had once beaten, dark and oppressive, was now just another fading memory, buried beneath the layers of new growth. The lodge had been a prison, yes, but it had also been a teacher, showing him the depth of his own resilience, the strength he had carried within him without even knowing it. The shadow that had once sought to devour him was gone, and in its place there was only light. And with that light came the revelation. He didn't need to remember who he had been. He didn't need to seek out his past. He had no need for the identity he had lost because, in the absence of that identity, he had become something new. Something that was free from the constraints of who he had once been. The forest had become a sanctuary, a place of rebirth. It had a quiet, profound power, the kind that only nature could provide. It was the kind of power that didn't demand, didn't judge, but simply was. And it was here, in the stillness of the forest, that he began to learn what it meant to truly live again. The forest itself began to speak to him in subtle ways. A rustle in the trees, a flash of light on the horizon. The way the leaves shifted in the wind, their dance a silent invitation to follow. He had once been blind to these things, too wrapped up in the noise of his own thoughts, in the weight of his memories, to hear what the world around him was saying. But now, with every step, he felt more attuned to it, more alive to it. Some nights, as he made camp beneath the canopy of trees, the fire crackling softly at his side, he would find himself staring into the flames. The crackle of the wood, the shifting embers, the way the shadows danced on the trees around him, it felt like a kind of meditation, a way of letting go. The fire, the darkness, the light, these things were his companions now. Not the shadows of the lodge. Not the darkness that had once plagued him. The fire gave him warmth, gave him a sense of peace. It was the simple comfort of knowing that, despite everything, he was still here. He was still breathing. The nights in the forest were quiet, but not lonely. Not anymore. The stars above shone brighter than he had ever seen them, their cold light a reminder of the vastness of the universe, of the millions of lives that had come before and would come after. He was just one of many, a fleeting moment in time, and yet there was a quiet kind of comfort in that. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in a wash of purples and oranges, he found himself standing at the edge of a stream, the water flowing gently over rocks, the sound of it soothing to his tired ears. He knelt by the water's edge, his fingers brushing the cool surface, feeling the current's pull, its gentle insistence. He had been walking for days, weeks, maybe longer, but there was something in the moment, in the stillness of the forest, that made him feel like he had finally found his place. The path ahead, though still uncertain, no longer seemed so daunting. The uncertainty had shifted into something else, something calmer. It was not fear of the unknown that gripped him now, but a quiet excitement, a sense of wonder. As the stream flowed before him, he reached into his pack and pulled out a small, weathered notebook. He had found it in one of the old cabins on the edge of the forest, abandoned and overgrown with ivy, a relic from another time. It had belonged to someone, a traveler, perhaps, or a hermit. Whoever they had been, they had left behind their words, their thoughts, scribbled into the pages. His fingers traced the edges of the pages, worn soft by years of handling. He hadn't thought much about it at first, but now, as he sat by the stream, the words in the notebook began to take on new meaning. They spoke of journeys, of roads traveled, of paths lost and found. The ink had faded in places, the words now blurred, but the essence of them remained. He opened the first page, reading the faded script aloud to the forest, as if sharing them with the world around him. To walk the path is to learn to live with the unknown. To let go of the past is not to erase it, but to embrace the present. Every step forward is a step toward discovery, not just of the world, but of yourself. The journey is not the destination, but the unfolding. He paused, looking at the stream as the words settled within him. The journey is not the destination. For the first time in what felt like forever, he understood the truth in those words. The journey was not about reclaiming what had been lost. It wasn't about finding himself in the places he had once known or searching for answers in the things that had been taken from him. It was about moving forward, one step at a time, and learning to be present in each moment. The path, uncertain as it was his to walk. And he didn't have to walk it alone. The forest around him, the creatures that had returned to the land, the wind that blew through the trees, it was all there, a quiet reminder that the world was always in motion, always shifting. Life was always unfolding. He wasn't just part of the journey, he was part of the world. The stars above blinked into view as the sky darkened, the first chill of night settling into the air. The fire flickered beside him, casting long shadows on the forest floor. He closed the notebook and tucked it back into his pack. For now, he would let the stream speak to him, let the silence of the forest fill his mind. He had no destination, no past to chase, just the present, just the path ahead. And with that realization, the last vestiges of the pain, the emptiness that had gnawed at him for so long, finally began to fade away. It was still there, but it no longer controlled him. He could live with it. He could move forward with it. As the fire crackled, and the stars spun above him in their ancient dance, he closed his eyes for a moment and allowed himself to drift into the quiet peace of the night. The forest was alive around him, the wind whispering its secrets, the water flowing with ancient wisdom. And he was finally at peace. Not because he had the answers, but because, for the first time in a long while, he had no need for them. Days melded into weeks, and the rhythm of the forest had become a part of him. He no longer counted time by the rising and setting of the sun, nor by the moon's phases that rolled across the sky in the dead of night. He counted time by the shifting of the earth beneath his feet, by the rustling of leaves in the wind, by the subtle changes in the flow of the stream that ran through the forest. It was a world where time was less a concept and more a gentle, natural force, stretching out like the branches of the trees, reaching but never hurried. The forest had, in a way, become his teacher. Every tree, every patch of moss, every animal that crossed his path offered lessons. Lessons in patience, in resilience, and in the unspoken language of nature. The world around him was alive with stories. There was no need for words, no need for memory, just an understanding that flowed from the earth into his soul, grounding him with every step he took. It was a place of learning, not through the stories he once told himself, but through the simple act of being. And in that simplicity he found something profound, a sense of peace he hadn't known he needed. But even in this peace there was a quiet hunger, a longing for something beyond the solitude of the forest, something just out of reach. It was on a morning, with the sun barely breaking through the canopy above, that the forest gave him his first true challenge. He was making his way along a narrow trail, the ground damp from the morning dew, when he heard it. A sound, distant at first, but unmistakable. A low, mournful cry, like the wailing of someone in pain. He froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. The sound echoed through the trees again, closer this time. It was no animal. It was human. Without thinking, he broke into a run, his heart pounding in his chest as he dashed through the undergrowth, following the sound. The trail grew more treacherous the further he went, the branches overhead thickening, the trees seeming to close in around him. Yet, despite the increasing darkness and the sense of foreboding, he pressed on, drawn toward the cry. It wasn't the fear of danger that urged him forward, but a deep, inexplicable need to help, to reach out to whoever or whatever was in pain. The forest's atmosphere shifted as he ran, the air thick with an electric tension. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches twisting and stretching like fingers in the dark. The wind, which had been gentle, suddenly picked up, swirling around him as if trying to steer him off course, pushing against him. But he pressed on, his legs moving with a desperation he couldn't quite explain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of running, he reached a clearing. It was different from the others, darker, more shadowed, as though the sun itself were hesitant to touch it. The grass in the clearing was thick and overgrown, the ground uneven and soft, as though it had never been disturbed. In the center of the clearing there was a figure. A woman. Her back was turned to him, her shoulders hunched, her hair wild and tangled. She was kneeling, her hands gripping the ground as if she were trying to hold herself up, her body trembling with the force of her cries. The air around her seemed to shimmer, a faint, almost ghostly glow radiating from her. She wore simple, worn clothing, nothing that marked her as a traveler, yet there was something about her presence that felt out of place, unnatural. For a moment he hesitated, unsure of what to do. The sight of her, so raw in her grief, stirred something deep within him. But the woman didn't seem to notice him at first. Her cries echoed through the clearing, each one laced with sorrow, like the very sound of despair itself. "Are you all right?" he called out, his voice tentative but steady. His heart raced in his chest as he took a few steps forward. The woman flinched at the sound of his voice, her body stiffening as though she hadn't expected anyone to be there. Slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes wide and glassy, as though she were lost in a dream or trapped between worlds. There was a look in her eyes, one that seemed to pierce through him, a gaze so intense it felt as though she were seeing into the very core of his being. But as her eyes locked onto his, something flickered, something that looked like recognition, though he couldn't place it. You're here," she whispered, her voice strained, filled with a mixture of surprise and desperation. "You've come." His throat tightened. There was something strange about the way she spoke, as though she had been waiting for him, as though she knew him. But he had never seen her before, never encountered her in all his time in the forest. "Who are you?" he asked softly, his steps halting as he came to a stop just a few paces away. "What's happening?" The woman's trembling hand rose to her chest, as though trying to still the pain within her. I was lost," she said, her voice quivering with emotion. "I've been lost for so long. But now you found me. You're the one who can set me free." The words sent a shiver down his spine. He wasn't sure what she meant, but there was a certain weight to them, like a burden placed upon him that he hadn't asked for. "Free from what?" he asked, his curiosity piqued, though unease was creeping into his mind. The woman's gaze flickered to the ground, her eyes filled with a deep sorrow. "The forest," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I am trapped here. This place, it has kept me bound for so long. I can feel it, it is what has kept me here. And now it's trying to take you too. You must leave. You must run." The forest shifted again, the air growing colder, heavier. The once welcoming sounds of nature grew muted, replaced by an eerie stillness that hung in the air like a suffocating blanket. A low rumble rolled through the ground, deep and ominous, vibrating beneath his feet. Suddenly, the woman's body jerked, her back arching as if something inside her were twisting. She cried out again, her hands clawing at the earth. It was then that he noticed the faint lines of dark veins, like roots, creeping along her skin, tracing the contours of her arms, her neck, her face. They looked like they were growing, spreading outward from her chest, slowly overtaking her. In that moment he understood. The forest, this cursed place, was alive in ways he had never imagined. It wasn't just a backdrop to his journey. It wasn't just a place where time had slipped away. It was a force, a sentient force that was still, even now, exerting its influence on everything around it. It was more than just a forest. It was a prison, a living, breathing entity that had claimed this woman, and perhaps countless others before her. "You," she gasped, her voice strained, "you can't stay here. You must leave." His mind raced as the air thickened around them, the shadows stretching like tendrils toward him. The woman's words felt more like a warning now, and he could feel the weight of them pressing on his chest, threatening to suffocate him. But the shadows weren't just after her. They were coming for him too. The forest was no longer just a sanctuary. It was a battleground, one that had been waiting for him to arrive. And now that he had, the forest would do whatever it took to keep him from leaving. The woman's trembling figure seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy, her body contorting in ways that no human form should. Her fingers dug into the soil beneath her, nails scraping against the earth, desperate as though trying to break free from something far greater than herself. Her eyes, wide and panicked, darted between him and the darkening forest, as though the very trees themselves were closing in, watching, waiting. "You have to go," she cried out again, her voice rising to a shrill, desperate pitch. "It knows you're here. It knows you're real. You've awakened it." The words hit him like a slap, and for the first time he truly understood the magnitude of what had been happening in the forest all along. The lodge, the shadows, the lingering dread, it had all been leading to this. He had thought that his battle had ended with the destruction of the lodge, but now, standing in this eerie clearing with the woman writhing in front of him, he realized that the true heart of the darkness had never been the lodge. It had always been the forest itself, and it was not content to simply allow him to leave. The trees, once silent and peaceful, now seemed to lean toward him, their branches stretching like dark fingers, their leaves rustling with a faint, sinister whisper. The very ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse, as if the earth itself were alive, breathing. It was a sensation unlike anything he had ever felt before, the sensation of being watched by something that was not just conscious but hungry. "You don't understand," the woman gasped, her voice weak and strained as she twisted on the ground. It's the forest, the heart of it. It never wanted you to leave. It's taken so many before you, and it will take you too. It waits, always waits, and now you've stirred it. It won't let you go. The earth beneath him trembled again, more violently this time, and he had to brace himself to keep from falling. His pulse quickened as a cold, unnerving realization seeped into his bones. The forest was not just a setting, it was a predator. A living, breathing entity that existed beyond the trees and the underbrush, an ancient power that had been lying dormant for countless years, watching, waiting for someone to awaken it. He had thought it was just the lingering influence of the lodge, that by destroying the heart of the lodge, he had rid himself of the darkness. But this was something else. Something far older, far more malevolent. And now it was angry. The woman's body bucked once more, her mouth opening in a silent scream, as the veins beneath her skin darkened, spreading like roots growing through her flesh. The sound of crackling would fill the air as the trees groaned, the forest itself seeming to respond to her agony. The branches began to sway and twist, and he could swear the shadows in the trees were moving, alive and reaching toward him. He stepped back instinctively, but there was nowhere to go. The clearing seemed to be closing in on him, the edges of the forest pressing in from all sides, suffocating. The air grew thick with the smell of damp earth, the sickly sweetness of decay, and something far worse, something acrid like the scent of burning flesh. He could feel the temperature drop as if the forest itself were exhaling a cold breath, its icy fingers curling around him. For the first time in a long while, fear seized his heart. He had faced shadows, had fought against an overwhelming force before, but this was different. This was not just a creature or an entity, it was the land itself fighting back, clawing at him with everything it had. It wanted him to remain, to be consumed by it as so many before him had been. The woman's voice broke through the tension, weak but filled with a strange, mournful clarity. You can't fight it. It will never let you leave. It chooses you, and you have no choice but to stay. The trees groaned louder now, their branches creaking as they swayed unnaturally, twisting and turning as if in pain. The ground shifted beneath his feet, and a low rumble echoed through the air, vibrating in his bones. The forest was alive, and it was coming for him. But there was something else, something deeper. Beneath the terrifying roar of the forest, beneath the crashing of the branches, there was a sound he hadn't noticed before. A sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a soft, almost rhythmic thumping, like the heartbeat of something massive and ancient, buried deep beneath the soil. The heartbeat of the forest. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. The forest itself was alive in a way he had never imagined. The trees, the ground, the air, they were all part of it. The darkness, the hunger, it had all been feeding off the land, growing stronger with every soul it trapped. The lodge had been its fortress, its means of gathering those who ventured too close. But now that the lodge was gone, the forest had awakened fully. It was not just a place, it was a force. He needed to get out. Now. His heart raced as he took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run, to flee this place before it consumed him as it had the woman. But as he turned to leave, the earth beneath his feet shifted once again, sending him tumbling forward onto the ground. His hands scraped across the rough surface of the dirt, his body jarred by the sudden fall. When he looked up, the clearing was no longer empty. The trees had grown taller, unnaturally tall, towering above him, casting long dark shadows that seemed to reach out like hands. The air was thick, suffocating. The wind had died down, leaving only an eerie stillness behind. The forest was watching him, every leaf, every branch, every root alive with the pulse of the ancient force beneath the ground. It was like the forest had closed in, trapping him here with no way to escape. The woman's cries had stopped. Her body was still, unmoving, as the veins beneath her skin pulsed with a sinister rhythm, like the beating of a drum. The forest had claimed her, and it would claim him too if he didn't find a way out. It's coming, the woman whispered, her voice ragged, barely audible. You've awakened it, and now it will take you too. Suddenly he heard a snap, like a twig breaking, and then another. Out of the shadows, figures began to emerge. At first they were indistinct, dark, shifting shapes at the edge of the trees. But then, as they stepped into the clearing, he could make out their forms. They were human, but not. Their faces were gaunt, their skin stretched tight across their bones, eyes hollow and lifeless. These were not people anymore. These were the lost. The souls the forest had claimed. the ones who had come before him. Their eyes, though empty, fixed on him with an unnerving intensity, and they were coming closer. The woman's voice, barely a whisper now, broke through the terror. "It's too late." His heart pounded as the figures closed in around him, their hollow eyes never leaving his face. The ground beneath his feet felt softer now, the earth almost alive, pulling at his legs, trying to drag him down. The forest had claimed him. It would claim him too. The forest was no longer just a place. It was a predator, and he was its prey. The figures closed in around him, their gaunt, hollow faces twisted with an eerie kind of sorrow. Their eyes, black and empty, held nothing but an insatiable hunger, an emptiness that seemed to pull at the very air. The forest had claimed them long ago, and now it was coming for him. Each step they took felt like a death sentence, a quiet promise that he would join them in the eternal hunger of the woods. The ground beneath him seemed to pulse, shifting and trembling as though the earth itself was alive. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was a force, ancient and relentless, its heart beating beneath the soil, echoing through every root, every branch, every leaf. The shadows stretched long and dark, creeping toward him, wrapping themselves around his legs, pulling at him, urging him to kneel before the ancient hunger of the forest. His breath quickened. He had to move. He had to escape. But the air had thickened, making it hard to breathe, as if the very atmosphere of the forest was closing in on him. The trees above groaned and creaked, their branches twisting like clawed hands reaching down to drag him into the darkness. The figures continued to move closer, their feet silent against the soft ground, their movements unnaturally fluid, like marionettes controlled by some unseen force. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their hollow gazes were enough, a silent, suffocating message. The woman, still writhing on the ground, whispered through gritted teeth, her voice barely audible. "It's the heart. The heart." The words pierced through the fog of fear clouding his mind. The heart of the forest. He had heard the legends, the whispers in the wind, the warnings of those who had come before him. It wasn't just the trees that were alive. It was something deeper, something ancient, buried in the very soil of the land. Something that pulsed with an unyielding hunger. The forest had always been a predator, but now it had grown bold. It had stretched its reach further than ever before, and it was claiming everything in its path. His eyes darted around the clearing, searching for any escape. The figures were moving closer now, their twisted forms looming just outside his reach. Their eyes glinted with an ancient malice, and he could hear the faintest whispers in the wind, soft voices that murmured in a language older than time, urging him to surrender, to join them. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. The woman's voice broke through the whispers again, her words filled with dread. "The heart, it calls to you, pulls you in. It won't let you leave." The ground rumbled beneath him, and he felt it in his bones, like the beating of a drum, a slow and steady pulse that resonated through the very earth. It was the heart. The forest was alive, and it was calling him, drawing him toward the center, toward the very core of its existence. It wasn't just the forest he had to escape, it was the heart itself, the source of all this darkness. His legs trembled, but he forced himself to move, stumbling backward. His feet found purchase on the uneven ground, and he pushed himself into a run, sprinting as fast as his legs would carry him. But the shadows followed. They clung to him, seeping into the very air, twisting around him like chains, dragging him back toward the center of the clearing. The heart was calling. It was an irresistible force, a pull that seemed to reach into his very soul, luring him deeper into the forest, deeper into the heart of the darkness. The trees seemed to close in, their branches snapping like brittle bones, the ground rising to meet him as though the earth itself was trying to swallow him whole. But still he ran. He couldn't stop. He couldn't let the forest win. He had come this far, fought so hard. There was no way he would allow himself to be swallowed by the darkness now. The figures of the lost souls were getting closer, their faces stretched into silent screams, their eyes endless pits of darkness. And then he saw it. Through the trees, there was a faint glow, pale and sickly, filtering through the branches like an otherworldly light. It was the heart, the very center of the forest's power. It was calling to him, urging him forward, drawing him in with an overwhelming force. He stumbled through the underbrush, his heart pounding in his chest. The ground beneath him became more unstable, the soil shifting like quicksand, sucking at his boots with every step. The air was thick with the scent of rot and decay, and the distant whispers seemed to grow louder, more frantic. He reached the edge of the clearing, and there it was, the heart. A massive, twisted tree stood in the center of the clearing, its bark dark and gnarled, its roots sprawling out like veins beneath the earth. The tree's trunk was thick and ancient, its surface slick with something dark and viscous, oozing from deep within its core. The glow that emitted from it wasn't light at all. It was a sickly, greenish aura that seemed to warp the air around it, bending reality itself. The forest's heartbeat thrummed louder here, deep and resonant, like the pulse of something alive. The closer he got to the heart, the stronger the pull became. It was as if the tree itself was alive, aware of his presence, beckoning him to come closer. He wanted to turn and run. He wanted to flee the entire forest and never look back. But he knew he had to face it. He had to face the heart, the source of all this darkness. He couldn't escape the forest until he destroyed it. The tree was the key, the center of it all. With a deep breath, he stepped forward. As his feet touched the earth beneath the massive tree, the ground trembled again. The forest seemed to roar in response. The figures of the lost souls behind him halted, their hollow eyes staring at him in silent, agonizing recognition. The woman's voice, faint and broken, reached him one last time. Destroy it, or become part of it. There is no other way. The moment her words faded, a rush of power surged through him, cold, invasive, and all-consuming. His body froze, and the forest seemed to close in around him, the tree's pulse filling his veins with an overwhelming energy. The glow from the heart intensified, bathing everything in its sickly light. In that moment he knew. The heart had chosen him. It had lured him here not to consume him, but to make him its vessel. It had been waiting for someone strong enough to carry its darkness, someone who would willingly serve as its vessel. The heart wanted to be free of the earth, to spread its influence across the land. It needed a body, a host, and it had found its prey in him. His body shook as the pulse of the heart washed over him, the sickly energy seeping into every fiber of his being. It was too much, the weight, the power, the darkness. It was choking him, suffocating him. But something else stirred deep within him. A spark, a resistance. He would not become the heart's vessel. He had fought too hard to let it claim him now. His mind, though clouded, still held on to the fragments of strength he had gathered. The fire within him, the will to survive, flared up against the pull of the heart. With everything he had left, he reached for the memory of the lodge's destruction, the fire that had burned away the heart of the evil there. He could do this. He could destroy the heart just as he had destroyed the lodge. The key was within him. It was always within him. With a cry that felt like it came from the deepest part of his soul, he gathered all his strength and focused it on the heart, on the very core of the darkness that threatened to consume him. The pulse of the tree began to slow as if it sensed his defiance, and in that moment, he released everything, every ounce of will, every shred of strength. The heart shuddered. The earth rumbled violently beneath him. The trees screamed as their roots began to crack and splinter, the very soil of the forest starting to split apart. The heartbeat of the forest faltered, slowed, and then it stopped. The forest fell silent. For a moment, there was only silence. The kind of silence that pressed against the ears, suffocating and all-encompassing. The deep, throbbing pulse of the heart had faded, leaving the world in an unnatural quiet, as though the very air held its breath in anticipation. The forest, once alive with its pulse, now seemed to hang in a strange stasis, frozen in time. His heart hammered in his chest as he stood there, trembling. The pulse that had once felt like an oppressive weight on his body was now gone. The oppressive pull of the heart had faded, leaving him with nothing but the bitter taste of uncertainty in his mouth. But even in this silence, he knew that it wasn't over. The trees were still bent under the pressure of something, as though their very roots had been shaken loose, their foundation crumbling. The earth beneath him had split in places, and the very ground seemed to be trembling with the aftershocks of the conflict that had just unfolded. The lost souls, the hollow-eyed figures that had once surrounded him, had stopped moving. Their eyes, still empty and staring, held no more malice. But they didn't retreat either. They stood like statues, their bodies frozen in time, as though they too were caught in the web of whatever force had been set loose in the forest. The woman, the one who had warned him, was still on the ground, her body slack, her eyes glazed over, as if the battle had taken its toll on her as well. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She had been caught in the heart's web just like the others. She had been its first victim. He took a shaky breath, his body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. It was over, he told himself. He had done it. The heart had been destroyed. He had broken its hold on the forest, severed the pulse that had bound the land together with its malevolent energy. But as he stood there, trying to gather himself, a creeping sense of unease began to settle over him. The forest felt wrong. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was a warning. And then a crack echoed through the air, loud and sharp, like the breaking of an ancient bone. He turned toward the heart. The great tree, once twisted and alive with that sickly glow, was now crumbling. The bark, which had seemed so invulnerable just moments ago, was splintering, cracking apart, sending chips of dark wood flying into the air. The very trunk of the tree seemed to be splitting open, as if something inside it was trying to break free. A tremor ran through the ground, and the air grew heavy with a strange, metallic scent. The heart wasn't dead, it was dying. The battle had disrupted its hold, but the energy it had once radiated was now unstable, chaotic, and destructive. The trees around him began to shake, their roots pulling violently from the ground, their massive branches crashing down around him, uprooted by the force of the tree's collapse. The very earth beneath his feet began to buckle, splitting open in jagged lines, sending rocks and soil flying in every direction. It wasn't over yet. With a surge of panic, he turned to flee, but the ground had already begun to swallow him whole. The earth beneath him cracked, sending him tumbling down into the widening crevasse. He reached out, his fingers scraping the edges of the broken earth, but it was too late. He fell. The world spun around him as he plunged downward into the darkness, the sound of the forest destruction above him muffled by the pounding in his ears. The trees, the broken earth, the falling branches, all of it was fading as he descended further into the depths below. He felt weightless, falling through the very fabric of the forest, as though he were being pulled into the heart of the earth itself. For what felt like an eternity, he fell, his body tumbling end over end through the darkness. Then, just as his strength began to fade, he crashed into something solid, soft, damp earth, and the sound of rushing water. He lay there for a long time, breathless, his body aching from the fall. His limbs felt like lead, his mind hazy from the shock. But he couldn't afford to stay down for long. The forest's pulse, that deep, ancient rhythm, still haunted the back of his mind, even as the world around him seemed to collapse into darkness. The heart hadn't been destroyed, not completely, and now it was dragging him down with it. With a groan, he pushed himself to his feet, hands scraping against the wet, moss-covered ground. The air down here was thick, cool with moisture, and smelled faintly of damp stone and decay. His eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light filtering through cracks in the earth above, the broken forest stretching far away. He had fallen into some kind of underground cavern, hidden deep beneath the forest's surface. The ground here was uneven, filled with pools of stagnant water and strange, twisted roots that crawled across the floor like snakes. The walls of the cavern were lined with stone, their surface slick with moisture, covered in patches of fungus and moss that seemed to thrive in the damp, oppressive atmosphere. It was a forgotten place, hidden beneath the forest for centuries, a dark underworld that had been sealed away for reasons long lost to time. But now, with the forest above him dying, with the heart still alive and pulsing in his mind, he understood. This was the true source, the real heart of the forest. A deep, guttural noise echoed through the cavern, sending a jolt of fear through his chest. It wasn't just the sound of the forest, it was something else, something ancient. The noise grew louder, vibrating through the walls, shaking the very ground beneath him. He had to keep moving. His feet moved of their own accord, pulling him toward the sound. His body, still aching from the fall, moved with a sense of urgency, as though it understood that if he didn't find a way out, if he didn't destroy the true heart, it would consume him. As he ventured deeper into the cavern, he could feel the presence of something far older, far darker than anything he had encountered before. The walls of the cavern seemed to close in around him, the air growing heavier with every step. There was something down here, a power that had been buried for so long, forgotten by the world above, but now awakened by his intrusion. And then he saw it. At the far end of the cavern, glowing faintly through the cracks in the stone, was a stone altar, roughly hewn, covered in ancient symbols and carvings. It radiated a faint, eerie light, like the dim glow of moonlight, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. On the altar lay a heart, Not a tree but an object, an artifact, a thing, alive, beating, pulsing with a dark, malevolent energy. It was no longer a tree. It was something worse. The heart in its truest form. The heart of the forest. And it was calling to him. The cavern felt alive, the stone beneath him seeming to thrum in time with the heart's pulse. He could feel it now, deep in his bones, the terrible, relentless draw of the heart's power. It was reaching for him, pulling him closer, desperate to reclaim him, to take him as its new vessel, its new host. He reached for the stone altar, feeling the air grow colder as he neared it, the pulse of the heart growing stronger. He was close, too close. But if he didn't stop it now, if he didn't destroy the heart completely, the forest would never be free. But the heart had already chosen him. The cavern trembled once more, the stone cracking beneath his feet as the cavern itself seemed to awaken, its walls shifting, bending. The heart was alive in ways he hadn't imagined, and it was no longer just a force of nature. It was something far darker. With one final, desperate breath, he reached for the heart, his fingers brushing its cold, pulsing surface, knowing that this was the end. The moment everything would be decided. The pulse of the heart throbbed in the air, a rhythmic, insistent thrum that seemed to echo through his very soul. It was no longer a distant beat but something tangible, something real, vibrating through his bones, tugging at his very being. Every fiber of his body screamed to retreat, to run, to flee from this unnatural force. But he couldn't. Not now. Not when he had come so far. The cavern's walls seemed to close in around him, the darkness pressing against him with a weight he couldn't shake. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of ancient dust that had settled long before his arrival. And yet, despite the foul stench, there was something else. Something sweet, like the scent of damp earth after a long rain. The scent of life, of something ancient and powerful, yearning to be free. It pulled at him, urging him to step closer. The heart, that thing of darkness and power, lay before him, beating steadily upon the stone altar. It wasn't like anything he had ever seen. It wasn't a tree or a root or a twisted mass of vines. It was a heart, a pulsing, living organ, encased in stone, surrounded by carvings and symbols that seemed to shimmer with an eerie light. It was both beautiful and grotesque, its surface smooth and dark, slick with something that glistened like sweat or venom. And it was alive. The stone beneath his feet continued to shake as he stepped closer, the pulse of the heart growing stronger, louder. The cavern trembled again, its walls groaning as though the very earth were in pain. His heart raced in response, beating in time with the thundering rhythm of the heart. The force was irresistible. The closer he got, the more it pulled at him, wrapping itself around his mind, his spirit. He reached out a hand, trembling, but something inside him still resisted. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper. The heart wasn't just a force of nature. It was a will, a mind, a hunger. It was alive, aware of him, and it knew what he was trying to do. For a moment, he hesitated. The heart had been waiting for him. It had chosen him. He had seen its power, its allure. It was the force that had shaped this forest, that had bound its roots deep within the earth, that had pulled so many before him into its grasp. It was the very essence of the land, and it was asking, no, demanding, that he embrace it. It wanted him. It was offering him power. Power like he had never known. Power over the forest, over life and death itself. Power to reshape the world as he saw fit. It whispered in his mind, soft and seductive, a voice that curled around his thoughts like a snake. Join me, it cooed. Become one with me. Embrace your true self. You were always meant for this. But the memories of his journey, the lodge, the shadows, the lost souls, flashed through his mind like lightning. The woman's words echoed in his ears, destroy it or become part of it. The forest was not his ally. It was a predator. It had only been waiting for someone like him, someone with the strength, with the will to sustain it, to give it life once more. He had been a fool to think that destroying the lodge would end his nightmare. The forest had been waiting for him all along. But now, standing here in the heart of it, he understood. The heart wasn't just a creature of the earth. It was a sickness, a parasite that lived on the life force of the land itself. It had been feeding on the souls of those lost in the woods, shaping them into its servants, into its echoes. And if he did not destroy it now, it would do the same to him. A cold wave of dread washed over him, a chill so deep it froze the marrow in his bones. This was it. He was at the very edge, teetering on the brink of oblivion. the heart would consume him. It would make him one of its own, one of the many souls who had succumbed to its influence. His fingers brushed the stone surface of the altar, and for a moment he felt the faintest flicker of a pulse beneath his fingertips, like a heartbeat, alive and powerful, waiting for him to claim it. But there was no going back now. With one last breath, he ripped his hand away, stumbling backward as if the very touch of the heart burned him. The cavern around him seemed to shift, the air growing thick with energy, crackling with a force that threatened to tear the world apart. His thoughts were scattered, broken, his mind screaming at him to leave, to run. But the heart's grip was already tightening around his chest, pulling him toward the stone altar once more. And then he heard it. A voice. A low voice, rumbling like distant thunder, echoing in the very bones of the cavern. You cannot escape what is already inside you. The walls shook again, this time violently, as if the cavern itself were alive. The heartbeat of the heart grew louder, filling his ears, shaking his skull, the very air vibrating with its power. The sound was deafening, overwhelming. His legs buckled beneath him, and he fell to his knees, clutching his head, trying to block out the deafening pulse. The heart's voice, no, not just the heart, but something deeper, spoke again, its words slithering through his thoughts like tendrils. You are already mine. I have been waiting. You knew it, didn't you? You knew you would come. And now, I will make you see. The ground beneath him cracked open, and from the fissures, dark roots began to emerge, twisting upward like snakes, wrapping around his limbs, pulling him toward the altar. The roots were cold, slick with some unnatural substance, their grip tightening like iron chains, locking him in place. He couldn't move. He couldn't fight it. His heart raced, his breath ragged, his body screaming for release, for freedom. The heart's power was overwhelming, suffocating. The roots dug deeper into his skin, their thorns slicing through the fabric of his clothes, biting into his flesh, their cold tendrils feeding on his essence. He could feel the life being drained from him, feel the energy of his body being consumed. The heart was feeding. But then something inside him snapped. It wasn't his mind. It wasn't his fear. It was something deeper, something primal. It was the part of him that had been forged through his journey, through every battle with the darkness, through every moment of terror. The part of him that had survived the forest, that had defied the shadows and the monsters. It rose inside him, a spark of defiance that refused to be swallowed by the abyss. With a violent, guttural scream, he pulled his arms free from the roots that held him, shattering their grip as though they were brittle twigs. His body screamed with pain, his muscles tearing, his skin ripping, but he didn't stop. His hands clenched into fists, and with a surge of energy, he lunged toward the heart, his fingers curling around the stone surface of the altar. The heart's pulse thundered in his ears, but he ignored it. He gripped the stone, and in a single desperate movement he pulled. The stone cracked under his hands, the symbols and carvings groaning as they twisted and splintered. The sound was like the groan of the earth itself, the very fabric of the forest unraveling beneath his touch. The heart shuddered in its casing, its pulse slowing, faltering. The roots, the dark tendrils that had been feeding on him, recoiled as if the very life of the forest were being cut off. But the battle wasn't over. As the heart began to collapse, the roots twisted in agony, tearing at the earth, howling in pain. The walls of the cavern cracked, and the ground beneath him trembled. The very fabric of the forest seemed to be unraveling, as though the land itself were dying. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the heart began to disappear. It didn't shatter, didn't break apart. Instead, it melted, slowly at first, then faster, its form disintegrating into black smoke that curled into the air. The cavern shook one last time, and then, nothing. The cavern fell silent. The silence that followed the destruction of the heart was unlike any silence he had ever known. It was not the peaceful stillness of a forest after a storm or the quiet that follows the passing of a creature's death. It was an unnatural quiet, one that seemed to stretch on forever, pressing against his eardrums, suffocating him. The air, which had once been thick with tension and power, now felt empty, hollow, as if it had been sucked out of existence. He collapsed to the ground, his body trembling from the exertion, the pain, and the overwhelming release of energy. His muscles screamed in protest, each movement sending a sharp jolt through his spine. He could barely summon the strength to rise, his fingers digging into the rough stone floor of the cavern for support. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the smell of something ancient and long forgotten. The earth beneath him was no longer alive with the heartbeat of the forest, but it still pulsed with an eerie energy, as though the land itself had been scarred by what had transpired. The walls of the cavern were cracked, splintered in places, and the floor was littered with shards of broken stone and splintered roots, the remnants of the heart's collapse. He breathed deeply, the sharp metallic taste of fear still on his tongue. His chest heaved as he tried to steady himself, to focus on something, anything, other than the overwhelming stillness that surrounded him. But even in the silence, something felt wrong. The forest above, the one that had been his prison, his battleground, was gone. He could feel it. The connection had been severed. The pull of the forest's heartbeat was gone, but so too was its life. The trees, once alive with energy, the very air that had once hummed with power, now it felt dead. He slowly stood, his legs unsteady beneath him, the dizziness of his near collapse still lingering in his head. As he moved to stand, the cavern floor groaned beneath him, sending a shudder through the ground, and he steadied himself on the jagged stone wall. He looked up, his eyes drawn to the remnants of the heart. The altar, once a place of dark power, was now nothing more than a hollow, broken slab of stone. The symbols that had once glowed with an eerie light were now dim, worn away by the force of the heart's destruction. The stone was cracked, fractured, and darkened, as if the very essence of the heart had seeped into it, leaving an indelible mark. And yet, even as the heart crumbled into nothingness, there was a faint, pulsing sensation that lingered in the air. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was the faintest echo, a remnant of the heart's energy, still lingering, still trying to claw its way back into the world. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. The forest's grip on him was gone, but its shadow still hung over him. Had he truly destroyed the heart, or had he merely delayed its return? There was a sinking feeling deep in his chest that told him this was not the end, not yet. His hand moved instinctively to his side, where his pack had once hung. But it was gone. The weight of the world had shifted, and in the confusion he realized that his equipment, his provisions, everything he had carried into the forest was now lost, scattered somewhere far behind him. He had entered this place with hope, with the intention of escaping, of finding a way out. But now, with the heart gone, the land felt alien. The paths were lost. The forest had once been a maze of shadows, but now it was something far worse, a void. The cavern stretched ahead, dark and endless, its walls slick with moisture, its floor uneven and treacherous. A shiver crawled up his spine as he surveyed his surroundings. This place felt wrong, not just in the physical sense, but in a deeper, more primal way. The land, the very earth, seemed to breathe around him as though it were still alive, alive with a lingering malice that had been released when the heart collapsed. He took a step forward, the uneven ground shifting beneath his boots. The very air felt thin, like a fog had descended over his mind, clouding his thoughts. The remnants of the heart's energy clung to him, like a weight pressing on his chest, urging him to retreat, to flee before the land turned on him again. But he couldn't go back. Not now. He had come this far, fought so hard, faced the darkness within the forest and within himself. He couldn't let it win. Not now. Not after everything he had lost. He moved forward, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the thick, damp earth. Every step seemed to echo in the cavern, a hollow sound that reverberated through the stone walls, but it was not the sound of hope. It was the sound of something waiting, something ancient, something that had been awakened by the heart's destruction. The walls of the cavern shifted, and the very stone beneath his feet seemed to move, undulating like liquid, as if the earth itself was reacting to the energy that had been unleashed. The pulse of the heart, that terrible thrum that had once dominated the forest, was gone. But now there was something else. A deeper, more terrifying presence, something that had been hidden beneath the surface for centuries. The forest had been its vessel, its prison, but now it was free, and it was angry. A low growl reverberated through the cavern, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. It was guttural, animalistic, filled with a hunger that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. It grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come from all around him. His pulse quickened and his breath caught in his throat. He turned in every direction but saw nothing. The cavern was empty, save for the shadows that stretched like fingers toward him, pulling him into the abyss. The growl deepened into a snarl, and then the earth itself seemed to shudder. The floor beneath him cracked open once more, and from the darkened fissures, figures began to emerge, shapes, twisted and malformed, crawling from the depths. Their eyes glowed a faint red, their forms twisted in unnatural ways. They were not human, not even animal. They were something else, something forged from the very darkness of the forest, from the ancient malice that had been held at bay by the heart. The remnants of the lost souls, the ones he had seen in the forest, the ones who had once served the heart, were rising again, but they were not the same. They were changed, twisted by the heart's final collapse, their forms deformed and broken. They moved in jerking, disjointed motions, their faces contorted in grotesque mockeries of life, their eyes empty but filled with a maddening, insatiable hunger. He could feel the darkness growing, filling the cavern, suffocating him as the figures closed in, their mouths agape with twisted, gaping maws. Their hands were outstretched, reaching for him, clawing at the stone, scraping the earth as though desperate to claim him. And the growling, that terrible sound, it grew louder, closer, as if something bigger was emerging from the depths. Something that had been waiting for the heart's collapse to set it free. The ground shook again, and the cavern walls seemed to crack, the air thick with a pressure so heavy that it felt like he couldn't breathe. And then, just when he thought the cavern would collapse entirely, the ground split open beneath him. He fell into the darkness. He fell for what seemed like an eternity. The ground had cracked open beneath him, and now, with nothing but empty air below, his body tumbled head over heels into the depths. His arms flailed instinctively, his breath a sharp gasp in the heavy, cold air. He tried to grasp onto something, anything, but it was as if the very space around him had become fluid, a dark abyss that had swallowed him whole. The walls of the cavern above him were distant, their faint glow vanishing as he descended deeper into the unknown. The air was thick with a stifling darkness, the pressure increasing with every passing second, suffocating, pulling him deeper into the heart of the earth. It was as though the forest itself had opened its mouth, swallowing him down to its core, to something ancient, older than anything he had ever known. Then, with a jarring impact, his body collided with something solid. The air was knocked from his lungs and pain shot through his back, but he didn't have time to process it. His mind raced, his heart pounding wildly. He had landed in an underground chasm, a vast, empty cavern stretching endlessly before him. He gasped for air, coughing violently, struggling to regain his bearings. The pain in his ribs and back throbbed, but he forced himself to his feet, shakily standing. The ground beneath him was cold and uneven, jagged rocks scattered around him, some of them sharp like daggers. His palms were scraped raw from the fall, his fingers trembling as he tried to steady himself. The darkness around him was absolute, but his eyes began to adjust. The cavern was massive, stretching out in every direction, the walls made of smooth, obsidian stone, slick and polished as though they had been carved by something otherworldly. The air was heavy with moisture, thick with the scent of earth, stone, and the faintest trace of something rotting. He could feel it. The presence. The growling, that deep, guttural sound, was louder now, vibrating through the very ground beneath his feet. It was coming from somewhere ahead of him, a sound so filled with hunger, so ancient and primal, that it made his blood run cold. His instincts screamed at him to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The cavern seemed to stretch on forever, an endless labyrinth of tunnels and fissures, all leading toward the same unearthly source. And then he saw it. The glow, faint at first but growing brighter, illuminated the cavern before him. It was a sickly greenish hue, casting long shadows across the stone floor. The glow pulsated, flickering like a dying flame, casting an eerie light on the shapes that writhed in the darkness. He could see them now, twisted, contorted beings, their forms barely human. The once souls of the forest, now distorted into something much worse. The shadows took shape. They were not just figures, they were monsters. Each one was an amalgamation of flesh and shadow, of lost souls fused with the very essence of the forest's darkness. Their eyes burned with that same hollow emptiness he had seen before, their bodies twitching and jerking with unnatural movements. Their limbs were elongated, their fingers tipped with jagged claws, their mouths stretched wide in grotesque, silent screams. They were the echoes of the heart, the forsaken, the consumed, and they had come to collect him. Before he could react, the ground beneath him trembled once more, and the cavern itself seemed to groan. The walls shuddered, cracking open in new fissures, and from deep within the abyss, something much larger stirred. The growl turned into a roar. The sound was deafening, shaking the very earth beneath him. His bones rattled with the force, and his breath caught in his throat as he spun toward the source of the noise. The shadows shifted, parting like the sea, revealing the creature that had awakened from the heart's destruction. It was massive, impossibly massive. The thing was beyond his comprehension, an ancient, writhing mass of twisted flesh and shadows, its body an ever-changing, amorphous form that seemed to stretch across the cavern. Its eyes were black pits, endless voids that burned with the same insatiable hunger that had devoured the forest. The creature's skin, if it could be called that, was a slick, oily black, covered in scars and gashes, as though it had been dragged through time itself. It was the true heart of the forest, the thing that had remained hidden in the darkness, imprisoned beneath the roots of the ancient trees, bound by the power of the heart. It had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the heart to fall, for the very land to open and release it from its prison. And now it was free. The cavern seemed to tremble with its presence, the stone walls cracking, the earth shaking as if the land itself was reacting to the creature's awakening. It moved, the very air distorting around it as it slithered forward, its body coiling and twisting like a serpent, its many eyes fixed on him, hungry, calculating. He could feel its gaze. It was inside his mind, crawling through his thoughts, digging into his very soul. He could hear its whispers, soft and seductive, speaking in a language older than time. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind with visions, visions of the forest, of the earth, of everything that had ever lived being consumed, reduced to ash, to dust. He stumbled backward, his mind reeling, his pulse racing. The creature advanced, each movement sending ripples through the air. Its body shifted and writhed, growing larger with each passing second, until it filled the entire cavern. It towered over him, its twisted limbs reaching down, claws scraping the stone floor, dragging itself toward him with unnatural speed. And then it spoke. Its voice was like the sound of 1,000 winds, a low, guttural growl that rumbled through the cavern like thunder. "You are nothing." The words echoed in his mind, their weight pressing down on him like a physical force. He tried to take a step back, but his legs were frozen, his body paralyzed by fear, by the very presence of the creature. It was too powerful, too ancient. He couldn't escape it. There was nowhere to run. He had thought that destroying the heart would end this, that it would be over. But the truth was worse than he could have imagined. The heart was never just a tree, a force of nature. It had been the prison, the seal that kept this thing at bay. And now the seal was broken. The creature, the true heart of the forest, lowered its head, its many eyes gleaming with malice. Its breath, hot and fetid, washed over him, carrying the scent of rot, of decay, of everything that had died in the forest. And then it spoke again, its voice thick with hunger. "You will be part of me. Forever." With that, the creature lunged. Its claws slashed through the air like a blur, and before he could react, they were upon him, wrapping around his body like chains, squeezing the breath from his lungs. The pressure was unbearable, crushing him under the weight of its monstrous form. His mind screamed, but there was no escape. For a moment, everything went black. The world had gone dark. Not the comforting kind of dark that comes when one closes their eyes to sleep, but the oppressive, suffocating kind, the kind of dark that wraps around you like a living thing, clawing at your mind, pulling you deeper into the depths of despair. The crushing weight of the creature's grip on his body was like an iron vice, its claws digging into his ribs, its oppressive breath filling his lungs with the taste of rot and decay. He had no air. He had no strength. His chest burned, his limbs were useless, and the world around him felt like it was spinning. But then something deep within him stirred. A spark. A pulse of defiance, of survival. His heart, which had been racing in fear, now thudded in rhythm with something else. Something ancient, something primal. His mind, clouded by panic, suddenly cleared. The abyss around him, the creature's presence, the dark whispers, it all seemed to recede just a little. And then he remembered. The heart. The forest. It had always been the heart. And the heart was not just a thing of power, of hunger. It was an idea, a force. And if it was a force, then perhaps, just perhaps, he could fight it. The creature's claws tightened, and his breath came in ragged gasps, but now he didn't feel completely helpless. His thoughts began to slow, his hands trembling, his mind whirling with the one thing that had always been his only true weapon: will. There was no way to defeat this creature by force alone. No blade, no spell, no strength could stand against something as ancient, as powerful, as alive as this force. But there was one thing that the creature lacked: understanding. The creature, the heart, was a force of nature, yes, but it was also a twisted, fractured version of what the forest once was. The forest had once been pure. It had once been connected to the cycles of life and death, of rebirth, of growth. But the heart had turned it into a monstrosity, a twisted reflection of itself, feeding on the very land it was supposed to protect. And it was angry. It was hungry. But if it was hungry, then it could be starved. A surge of energy shot through his chest. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for everything. For the balance of the forest. For those who had been consumed by the heart. For the forest itself, which had been bent and twisted into something dark and foul. His mind shifted, and he began to think not of his own survival, but of the forest's survival. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was the last thread of what remained, the last possibility of hope. With every ounce of strength, he strained against the creature's grip, his body convulsing as he felt the power surge through him. He knew deep down that his only chance was to sever the creature's hold on this world, to deny it the very essence of the forest that it fed upon. With a primal roar, he shoved his hands against the creature's claws, his fingers trembling with the effort. The cavern around him trembled, the walls vibrating as if the earth itself could sense his resolve. The air, thick with the scent of decay, seemed to thicken further as though it too was waiting for the inevitable battle. His hand brushed something, a jagged rock, sharp as a blade. His fingers tightened around it, the stone cool and solid against his skin. It wasn't much, but it was something. Something to hold on to, something to fight with. He struck. The rock cracked against the creature's claw, sending a shock of pain through his arm as the creature's grip tightened in response. The creature growled, a low, guttural sound that seemed to shake the very stone beneath them. Its claws raked deeper into his skin, but he didn't stop. Again and again he struck, each blow fueled by desperation, by rage, by an unyielding force that refused to let the forest fall. The creature howled in anger, its body writhing, its many eyes flashing with an insatiable hunger. It was maddened, driven by the fury of its centuries of imprisonment, its twisted form now unraveling in the wake of his attack. The air around them seemed to pulse with its rage, the darkness swelling as if to drown them both in its endless night. But still he fought. The stone, though crude and small, became a symbol. Each strike was an assertion of life, of will, of resistance. The forest had been broken, twisted into something dark and foul, but that didn't mean it was gone. It hadn't disappeared completely. It was still there, beneath the surface, in the roots, in the very fabric of the earth itself. And with each blow, the creature's grip loosened. The air seemed to hum, crackle, and then, snap, the pressure around him broke. He gasped as the claws released their hold on him, the creature's grip faltering as the stone shattered across the creature's massive, writhing form. The creature howled in fury, but it was no longer in control. It was weakening. Now was the time. He stood, blood dripping from his arms, his legs trembling with exhaustion. The creature loomed before him, but its form was faltering. The darkness that surrounded them seemed to be pulling away, retreating into the corners of the cavern like a tide pulling back from the shore. His heart pounded as the realization settled in. He wasn't alone. The forest was with him. The strength, the power of the land, the rebirth that had once been its essence. It was still there, still waiting. It had been waiting for this moment to come. And with it, the very heart of the forest beat again. The ground beneath his feet shifted, the cracks in the stone walls widening. Something deep below him, something ancient, was awakening. The pulse of the land, faint at first, began to grow stronger, resonating with the heartbeat of the forest. It was a rhythm, an unyielding force of life and death, of renewal and decay. The creature roared in fury as the pulse intensified, its twisted form growing more chaotic, more unstable. The earth beneath him began to crumble, the stone walls splintering as if the very foundation of the cavern were tearing itself apart. And then, with a deafening roar, the creature's form split, its monstrous body cracking apart like an old, withered tree. The creature screamed, its voice a chorus of pain and rage, but it was no longer the forest's ruler. It was its prisoner. The forest's heartbeat had shattered its power, and now the earth itself was reclaiming what had once been its own. and then the ground gave way beneath them. With one final, terrifying roar, the creature was consumed, dragged into the depths of the earth, into the darkness it had once emerged from. The pulse of the forest, slow and steady, grew louder like a song, a final release from the grip of the darkness that had threatened to swallow everything. The cavern shuddered, the air growing thick with the scent of fresh earth and ancient decay. The stone walls collapsed inward, but the darkness began to lift, the pulse of the forest growing stronger, clearer. He was alive. The creature was gone. And the forest, the true forest, was beginning to heal. The forest was quiet. Almost too quiet. It was an unsettling kind of silence, like the breath that follows a storm, when the world holds its breath, unsure of what comes next. The ground beneath him was still, but there was a faint pulse in the air, a hum that seemed to vibrate through the very earth. The cavern had collapsed, but it hadn't crumbled into destruction. It had transformed. The dark heart of the forest had been torn out, but now there was room for something else to grow in its place. For a long moment, he simply stood there, his body trembling, his clothes torn, his skin still slick with blood and the remnants of the battle. He had survived. The creature, the dark thing that had ruled the forest for so long, was gone. It had been consumed by the very earth it had tried to corrupt. The force that had controlled the land, the one that had turned the forest into a twisted nightmare, had been driven back, banished, perhaps forever. But even as the dust settled, he knew this wasn't the end. Not really. The forest was not gone. It was not destroyed. It had merely been wounded, scarred by the years of darkness. The damage had been done, but the true power of the land was still there, buried beneath layers of fear and decay. And now the forest was stirring. He could feel it in his bones, the slow awakening of the land, the faintest brush of life returning. There was still a subtle thrum in the earth, a quiet pulse that beckoned him forward. It was as if the trees, the ground, the very air were calling to him, asking for his help. The heart was gone, yes, but the forest still needed healing, and he had the power to guide it. Slowly he stepped forward, the weight of his exhaustion heavy on his shoulders. His limbs ached with every movement, his body still reeling from the struggle. But his mind was clearer now, focused in a way it hadn't been before. The memories of the past, of the people who had been lost in the forest, of the horrors that had unfolded. Those memories didn't fade, but they didn't paralyze him anymore either. He had done what he came to do. The forest had been freed from its chains, and now it was up to him to guide it back to the light. He moved cautiously, each step slow, deliberate. The stone floor of the cavern beneath his feet had given way to soft earth, rich with moisture, like the forest floor after a rainstorm. The air was thick with the scent of new growth, of roots stretching into the dark, seeking the light. And then he saw it. At first it was just a faint glimmer in the distance. But as he drew closer, the shape became clearer. Tall, elegant trees, their bark pale and smooth, their branches reaching high into the air like arms stretching toward the sky. They weren't like the twisted trees of the corrupted forest. No, these trees were alive with the pulse of life, their leaves vibrant, their branches strong and healthy. The air around them shimmered with a faint golden light, like the first rays of dawn breaking through the canopy after a long, dark night. It was beautiful. It was hope. He stopped for a moment, standing at the edge of this new grove. His breath caught in his throat as he looked at the trees, their trunks like pillars of life, glowing with a quiet strength. The forest, this part of the forest, was healing. He could feel it in the air, in the very earth beneath him. It was as if the forest had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to reach this point, to guide it into the next chapter of its existence. And yet, even as the beauty of the grove surrounded him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something else was lingering, something not quite finished. The battle with the heart had been won, yes, but the forest's soul had been fractured. Even as new life sprouted, there was a lingering darkness beneath the surface, a residue of the malevolent force that had once ruled here. The forest had been freed, but its wounds were still fresh. There was a long road ahead, one that would require time, patience, and care. He moved forward, his steps lighter now, as if the very earth was welcoming him. The trees seemed to sway in the breeze, their branches whispering in a language he couldn't understand, yet he could feel it in his chest, like a song, a soft rhythm that echoed in his bones. The pulse of the earth was growing stronger now, the hum beneath his feet vibrating through the very air, until it filled his mind, his thoughts, his very soul. It wasn't just the land healing, It was something more, something greater. He knelt down beside one of the trees, running his fingers gently across its smooth bark. The touch was almost reverent, like he was honoring the life it represented. And as he did, a strange sensation washed over him, like a whisper in his mind, a voice that was not his own, yet somehow familiar. It was soft, gentle, like the murmur of the wind through the leaves. "You've returned." The words were not spoken aloud, but they resonated deep within him, like a distant memory being recalled. It wasn't a voice of the past, but the voice of the forest, the true forest, the soul of the land, the essence of life that had been buried beneath the heart's darkness. It was awake now, alive again. The voice continued, softer now, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. "You are the guardian, the keeper of balance." He froze. Guardian. It was a title, a role. He had never thought of himself that way, but in this moment, standing in the heart of the forest, he understood. The forest had chosen him. The forest had always chosen him. The weight of the responsibility settled over him, but instead of fear, he felt purpose. This was what he had come for, what he had been shaped for. The heart had drawn him here, but it was not the heart's power that had given him strength. It was the forest itself, the balance between life and death, the eternal rhythm that pulsed in the soil beneath his feet, the wind in the trees, the whispers in the night. He was part of it now. He had always been part of it. And now he would be the one to protect it, to guide it back from the brink of destruction. The trees swayed above him, the gentle sound of their leaves rustling in the wind like a chorus of voices, ancient and wise. The voice spoke again, this time with more clarity, with more purpose. "You must seek the roots, the foundation of this land. The heart may have been destroyed, but its echoes remain. You must find them before they spread again, before they corrupt what we have rebuilt." He nodded, a deep sense of understanding filling him. He had come for the heart, yes, but now his task was greater. He was not just a survivor. He was the steward of the forest's soul, the one who would see it through this rebirth. The voice faded, but its presence lingered in the air, like a song that played just at the edge of hearing. He stood, taking a deep breath, feeling the pulse of the land beneath him, the power that flowed through the very earth. He could feel it now, the path ahead of him. It was not just a journey through the forest. It was a journey through the heart of the land itself, into the deep places where life began, where the true roots of the forest lay hidden. And as he began to move toward that path, the forest seemed to guide him, its whispering winds pointing the way. The trees parted for him, their branches bending with a grace that seemed to beckon him forward. He was no longer a stranger to this place. He was home. The journey had not ended. It had only just begun. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it an ancient promise. It was as if the forest itself was alive, not just in the way trees grow and leaves fall, but in the way a heart beats, slow, steady, eternal. He could feel it in his chest, the rhythm of the land syncing with his pulse, as though the very earth was breathing alongside him. He had been marked, chosen, and now he had to walk the path of the guardian. The trees that surrounded him were different now. They were not just silent watchers of the world, but sentinels guiding him, offering their wisdom without words. Their branches stretched high above him, their leaves rustling in a language he didn't understand, yet somehow knew. They bent toward him as he passed, their roots deep beneath the earth, intertwined with the land's very essence. They were not just a part of the forest, they were the forest. He moved with purpose now, no longer driven by mere survival, but by the weight of a responsibility that had been thrust upon him. The path ahead was unclear, the shadows stretching long and deep as he ventured further into the heart of the land. But the forest knew. It had always known. The forest's pulse was guiding him. And so he walked deeper into the forest, following the rhythm, the pull, the quiet call of the roots that stretched beneath the earth. The trees parted for him, as if creating an unseen path through the underbrush, a trail that only he could see. With each step, the air grew thicker, richer, as if the earth itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. Something that only he could bring. The deeper he went, the more the forest seemed to shift. The sounds of the world grew muffled, swallowed by the dense canopy above. Even the rustling of the leaves became quieter, softer, as if the forest was cocooning him in a blanket of silence, urging him to listen, to feel, to understand. The ground beneath his feet shifted from soft, wet earth to something more solid, more ancient. The air was thick with the scent of moss and decay, But there was something else here, a faint electric energy that hummed just beneath the surface, something older than the trees, older than the forest itself. It was the roots. The deeper he moved, the more he could feel them, curling beneath the surface like serpents, twisting through the earth, reaching toward something. They were alive with power, as if they were pulsing with a life of their own. And beneath them, something was waiting, something ancient and forgotten. It called to him, its presence both terrifying and comforting, like a memory of something long lost. He felt the weight of it, a pressure in his chest as he reached a clearing. It was unlike any he had seen before, an open space where the trees seemed to bow inward as if forming a great dome above him. In the center of the clearing stood a single stone, dark and smooth, its surface covered in intricate carvings, symbols that seemed to shift and change as he gazed upon them. It was a marker, a gateway. The stone was ancient, older than anything he had encountered in the forest, older even than the heart. It was the heart of the forest, the core of its existence, its roots stretching down into the earth, drawing power from a source that was not of this world. He could feel it now, the pull, the force, the energy that radiated from the stone. It was the source of the forest's power, the thing that had given life to the trees, the creatures, the land. It was the foundation of everything that had ever existed here. But it was not just life, it was also death. It was creation and destruction, balance and chaos. The forest had been built upon it, and it had been torn asunder by the heart. And now it was calling him. He stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached for the stone. The symbols on its surface seemed to come alive, swirling and shifting like smoke, pulling him in. The moment his fingers brushed against its cool surface, the ground beneath him trembled, and a low hum filled the air, a sound that resonated deep within his bones, as if the earth itself was alive with a power too immense to comprehend. And then the stone split, not with a crack, but with a slow, deliberate motion, as if it were unfolding, revealing something beneath it, a darkness that poured out like ink, spreading across the clearing. It was the roots, the true roots, those that had been buried beneath the earth for millennia, hidden away by the very land that had once worshipped them. They were long and twisted, their surfaces slick and glistening with a black substance that shimmered like oil in the moonlight. The darkness spread, curling and twisting, wrapping itself around the trees, creeping through the soil, reaching up toward the sky. It was not just a physical presence, but an intangible one, a dark force that seeped into the very air, thickening it, suffocating it. The wind, once gentle, now howled, pulling at his clothes, tugging at his skin as if trying to drag him away. But he could not move. He could not look away. The roots writhed like living things, their motion slow and deliberate, like the pulse of some great, slumbering beast. The darkness was alive. The roots were alive, and they were reaching for him. He heard a voice, a whisper, so faint it was almost inaudible, but it pierced through the noise of the wind and the rustling of the leaves. It was a voice from deep within the earth, from the very heart of the forest. You have come. The words were not spoken aloud, but echoed in his mind, vibrating through his very being. They were not words of welcome. No, they were words of warning. You are not ready. The ground beneath his feet shifted once more, and he staggered as the earth cracked open, revealing an abyss so deep, so black, that it swallowed the light. The roots surged forward, reaching for him, their black tendrils like snakes, twisting and coiling around him, dragging him toward the center of the darkness. He fought against them, but the more he struggled, the stronger the roots became. They wrapped around his limbs, his torso, pulling him down into the earth, into the abyss, deeper and deeper. He could feel the weight of the forest pressing against him, the pressure of the roots, the darkness, the power that had lain dormant for so long. And then, as the roots tightened their grip, as the abyss drew closer, he realized the truth. This was not just the forest. This was not just the land. It was everything. The roots were not just physical. They were metaphysical, spiritual, the very foundation of existence. The balance between life and death, between creation and destruction. The forest had called him here, but it had not done so for redemption. It had done so to test him. The pulse of the earth, the energy that had surged through him during the battle against the heart, was not just power. It was part of the force that held the roots in place, a force that had been bound by the ancient stone. The roots, the darkness, they were always there, always waiting. And now they were testing him. The forest had been freed from the heart, but its true darkness had not yet been sealed. And now it was his choice. The darkness of the roots was closing in around him, suffocating him, filling him with the weight of the land's ancient power. He could feel the forest in his veins, could feel the darkness trying to consume him, trying to pull him into its depths. The question was no longer whether he would survive. The question was whether he would become part of this darkness, this endless, eternal force, or if he would rise above it. But in the depths of the abyss, he found a clarity. He found his answer. It wasn't a matter of surviving. It was a matter of choosing. The roots that had reached for him, had tried to pull him down, were not just part of the forest. They were part of him. He was not the savior of the forest. He was its balance, and he would choose. The world around him seemed to vanish, the abyss swallowing every inch of light until he stood at the very edge of oblivion. The roots, those ancient and living threads of darkness, tightened around him, pulling him deeper into the earth with relentless strength. His breath came in shallow gasps as the air grew thick and suffocating, the ground beneath him alive with an ancient hunger that threatened to consume him whole. In the endless blackness, time seemed to lose its meaning. The very air pulsed with the beating of the forest's heart, a rhythm that echoed in his bones, reverberating through every fiber of his being. It was no longer just the pulse of life, it was the pulse of death, the pulse of the very cycle of creation that had turned into something monstrous. The roots, they were not just part of the forest. They were the forest's soul, its essence stretching deep into the core of the earth, feeding on the land's eternal power. He could feel the weight of it, the weight of the choice that hung over him. The darkness was all-consuming, its tendrils wrapping around him, binding him in place. Yet within the darkness, something flickered. A faint light, barely perceptible, like a distant star fighting against the crushing tide of night. His mind reeled, a storm of thoughts crashing against one another. The forest had been twisted by the heart, yes, but now that the heart was gone, there was something new to contend with. The roots, the true force beneath the land, had been freed from their prison. And in that freedom they had become something else. Something that demanded control. The roots were not just the embodiment of life. They were the embodiment of the balance between life and death. They were the foundation of the land, the pulse of the world itself. And yet, in the absence of the heart, they had become lost. They had no master, no purpose but their own. And they reached for him now, not with kindness but with a hunger, a desire to claim him as their own. He could feel it now, the ancient force of the roots. They were trying to bind him, to make him part of them, to drag him down into their eternal grasp. He could feel their power surging, their tendrils like molten iron, burning into his flesh, digging into his soul. But something else was stirring in the depths of his mind. Something older than the roots. Something that had always been with him, buried beneath the fear, beneath the survival instinct. It was the forest itself. The true forest, the one that had once stood tall and strong, with roots that had connected every living thing from the smallest leaf to the highest branch. It had been twisted, yes, but it had not been destroyed. It still lived, still breathed, still pulsed beneath the surface of the earth. And now the choice was his. The roots were calling him. They were offering him power, unfathomable, ancient power. They wanted him to join them, to become one with the darkness that had always lurked beneath the soil. But there was another voice, faint but growing louder. It was the forest's voice. The voice of the trees, of the earth, of the wind and the sky. It was a song, a melody older than the stars, a song that had been passed down through the ages. And now, in this moment of choice, that song called to him, urging him to remember who he was. The guardian. He was not the forest's servant. He was its protector, its keeper of balance. The forest had chosen him, not to wield its power, but to maintain its harmony. He was not meant to be consumed by the roots, to become a part of the darkness. He was meant to guide it back from the brink, to restore the balance between life and death, creation and destruction. And in that moment he understood. The choice was never about power. It was about purpose, about maintaining the balance, even in the face of the greatest temptation, the deepest abyss. The roots wanted him, yes. They wanted to pull him down into their darkness. But they could not consume him because he had something they did not. His will, his heart, his very soul. They were not theirs to take. He was not their puppet. He was the guardian. The forest had chosen him for this purpose, and now it was time to fulfill it. With a sudden surge of energy, he broke free from the roots, his limbs trembling with the force of his defiance. The darkness roared in frustration, but he stood firm, his feet rooted to the earth, his body alive with the power of the land itself. The roots writhed around him, but now they were nothing but a distant echo of the power they had once commanded. He raised his hands, and the air around him seemed to shimmer. The pulse of the forest grew stronger, the rhythm of life and death resounding through his veins. He was the conduit, the bridge between the two forces, the light and the dark, the creation and the destruction. And now he was ready to restore the balance. The roots howled in fury, but their power was fading, their hold on him weakening. The forest's true power surged through him, flooding his senses with a brilliant light. The darkness recoiled, but it was too late. The balance was already shifting, already being restored. The roots began to retreat, their dark tendrils loosening, fading back into the earth from which they had come. The once vibrant trees, the ones twisted by the heart, began to shed their corruption, their bark slowly turning from blackened ash to a soft, living brown. The forest was healing, piece by piece, branch by branch. And then, as the last of the roots faded from view, the ground beneath him began to tremble. Not with the fury of the dark forces, but with the tremor of new growth. He felt it deep within his chest, the pulse of life returning to the land. It was slow at first, but it was there. The forest was breathing again. The voice of the forest, once a whisper, now sang louder, its song growing clearer with each passing moment. It was a melody of rebirth, of renewal, of a land once again alive with hope. The trees swayed, their branches dancing in the wind as if reaching for the sky, their leaves glowing with a soft, golden light. And then, in the center of the clearing, a new tree sprouted. It was not like the others. Its trunk was thick and sturdy, its leaves shimmering with a faint, ethereal glow. It stood tall, reaching for the heavens, its roots stretching deep into the earth like a bridge between the land above and the realm below. It was the new heart. The old heart had been destroyed, yes, but in its place something greater had emerged. A heart that was not twisted by the darkness, but one that would grow in balance with the world around it. It would not rule over the forest, it would be part of it, a guide, a symbol of the harmony between life and death. The forest had healed, and he had played his part. The ground beneath him softened, and he sank to his knees, exhausted but triumphant. The path ahead of him was still long, still uncertain, but he had fulfilled his purpose. The forest had been saved, its true balance restored. He looked up at the sky, the first rays of dawn breaking through the canopy, casting a soft, golden light across the clearing. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the world felt right again. The forest was no longer a place of darkness. It was a place of life. And he, the guardian, would see it through the ages to come. The roots tugged at him with a force that felt like 1,000 hands pulling him into the depths of the earth. Their dark tendrils wrapped around his limbs, binding him in place, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. His lungs felt heavy as the earth closed in around him, the roots twisting deeper, pressing against his chest. The world seemed to close in, suffocating him, as the ancient voice echoed in his mind. "You cannot escape us." It was not a threat. It was a truth. The roots were the soul of the land. They were not merely a force of darkness, they were the very foundation of the forest, of the world itself. And as much as he had tried to rid the forest of their power, he could not deny what they were. He could not sever them from the land any more than he could sever himself from his own heartbeat. In that moment, a realization surged through him, a painful clarity. He was part of the forest just as the roots were part of him. He had been chosen as its guardian, but not to rule over it, not to control it. His purpose was not to banish the roots, but to understand them, to learn how to walk in harmony with them, to hold the balance between life and death, creation and destruction. He had spent so long running from the darkness, from the power of the roots, trying to keep them at bay. But now he understood that he could not destroy what was inseparable from the land. The darkness was not something to fear, it was something to be embraced, something to learn to coexist with. The roots, sensing his shift in understanding, loosened their grip slightly, allowing him to breathe, to think. He could feel the pulse of the forest beneath him, its rhythm beating in time with his own heart. He was no longer fighting against it. He was no longer resisting. Instead, he was becoming one with it. With a final surge of will, the guardian reached out, his mind connecting with the roots, feeling their ancient power flow through him. The energy was overwhelming, but he did not shy away. He accepted it, allowing the darkness to merge with the light within him. He was not bound by the roots, he was one with them. The earth trembled beneath him as the roots retreated, pulling back into the soil, leaving him standing in the clearing once more. The forest was silent, the heavy air now light, as if the land had exhaled a deep, relieved breath. The trees around him swayed gently in the wind, their leaves rustling in quiet acknowledgement. The guardian opened his eyes, his body aching but his spirit alive with a newfound power. The forest had not been destroyed. It had been transformed. The balance between life and death, creation and destruction, was fragile, but it was his responsibility to protect it. The ancient voice, no longer a threat, now spoke with a calm, measured tone. You have learned, guardian. You have embraced the darkness and the light. You are the bridge between the two. The forest is yours to protect, but you are not its ruler. You are its keeper. The guardian nodded, understanding the weight of the responsibility now resting on his shoulders. He was not here to impose his will on the land, to bend the forest to his command. He was here to guide it, to help it grow, to maintain the delicate balance that kept it alive. As he stood there, the roots beneath him pulsed with a quiet power, no longer threatening but alive with energy. They were not evil. They were not to be feared. They were simply a part of the forest, a part of the land's eternal cycle. And as the sun began to rise, casting a golden light over the trees, the guardian knew his journey had only just begun. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, there would be shadows that threatened to darken the land once more. But he was ready. The forest had chosen him, and now he had chosen the forest. Together they would endure. Together they would thrive. The guardian took one last look at the clearing, at the heart tree now fully restored, its branches reaching high into the sky, its roots strong and steady in the earth. The forest was alive again, alive with balance, alive with the promise of the future. And as he turned to walk deeper into the forest, his heart steady and his mind clear, he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer just a man. He was the guardian, the keeper of the land, the bridge between the darkness and the light. And he would protect the forest, for as long as the roots ran deep and the trees whispered in the wind.